This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recorded by Celine Major. The Young Pretenders by Edith Henrietta Fowler. Chapter 1. In the Garden. Granny would never come back any more. At least, that was what Nurse said, and so the children knew that it must be true.
"When we're grown up, shall we know everything right like Nana does?" asked Babs, as they talked it over afterwards in the garden.
"I dare say," answered Teddy, carelessly. "What shall we play at now, Babs?" So the children forgot the news that Nurse had told them, and cheerfully accepted the fact that their grandmother, with whom they had lived during the whole of their short lives, had gone away indeed beyond recall. It did not matter much to them. They had always thought of Granny as a piece of the drawing room furniture, quite a nice piece, but dull and delicate, as most drawing room furniture is to the child mind. She had never entered into their world at all. That was peopled by a host of pretending folk, all the animals they ever came across, and most of the servants with their relatives and acquaintances inclusive. Such an interesting world it was, bounded by the brook and the lanes, and full of excitement in the first bird's nest, and the young rabbits, to say nothing of Giles the gardener's thrilling stories. And besides, it was several weeks now since Granny had gone away to London, and the memory of her was already growing a little dim. Teddy and Babs had both almost cried their eyes out when Don the retriever died. But then he was a real friend of theirs, and that makes a great difference. "Good morning, little master and Missy," said Giles, as the two children peeped in at the tool house door. "Has Nurse told you the sad news?"
"No, what?"
cried Babs, anxiously.
"Soot hasn't been caught in a trap again, has she?"
And the little girl's face paled with apprehension.
"I mean about your poor dear grandma."
"Oh, is that all?"
said Babs, with a sigh of relief.
"You gived me such a fright 'bout darling Soot."
"Nana told us Granny isn't never coming home again," answered Teddy. "But, Giles, do take us to see the nest you found yesterday."
"Yes, do,"
pleaded Babs.
"Sakes alive!" ejaculated the old man. "What callous creatures children be!"
And he drew his horny hand across his eyes, and finished the plant he was potting before they all three started for the plantation, the children dancing round him with the delight of a couple of terriers just turned out of the kennel.
"Teddy,"
said Babs, when their excitement about the nest had abated, and the gardener gone back to his work,
"if that other big nest right up at the top of the tree that Giles told us 'bout is so high what no ladders can reach it, how did anybody reach to put the eggs in?"
This was rather a poser for Teddy. But that was the worst of Babs. She was always asking such difficult questions, and Teddy, deep down in his masculine mind, could not bear to own that he did not know.
"I 'spect somebody climbed,"
he said dubiously.
"Oh, who?"
asked his sister eagerly.
"It couldn't have been Giles nor Nana nor Granny nor the gardener's boy, 'cause I asked him specially if he couldn't get me one of the eggs for our c'lection, and he said it was much too high. Who could it be?"
"Somebody in the night. P'raps a fairy."
"P'raps an angel. Oh, yes," surmised Babs, "that must be it. One of those I 'spect out of four corners to my bed."
"Yes," said Teddy, thankful that the subject was satisfactorily settled, "on their way down, you know."
"What shall we play at now?" continued the little girl. "Let's pretend we're the Stoners."
Mr. and Mrs. Stoner were a very erratic couple, whose varied experiences were Bab's great delight. She was always Mrs. Stoner, the fond mother of a most dilapidated family of dolls, and a cheery, chatty matron, notwithstanding all her cares, and Teddy was Mr. Stoner. At least, he always began by being Mr. Stoner, and then to Bab's sorrow he generally turned out to be either a prince in disguise or a terrifyingly wicked man called Henry Baker. It was naturally very upsetting for Mrs. Stoner when either of these changes took place, and indeed, on one memorable occasion her husband had suddenly become a lion, which was manifestly perturbing in any well-regulated household. Poor Babs used to implore Teddy not to turn out into anybody else. But he was rather a romantic boy, and enjoyed the unexpected. Moreover, He had one great advantage over Babs, which influenced his style of play. He, being 7 years old, could read exciting fairy tales and work out his pretenses on those lines; while his little sister, being only 5, was out of all this. For such sentences as "that fat cat," which were at present her literary boundaries, did not tend to inspire fresh thoughts or ideals.
"Don't turn out to be any one else," pleaded Babs. "Be just Mr. Stoner." "I can't be sure," said Teddy, solemnly.
"Well, then, do begin by being the prince. I'd rather have that than turning out."
But in the end, as usual, Babs played Teddy's way, and Mrs. Stoner opened proceedings by giving a sumptuous dinner party. Her only guests were snapdragons, chosen as most suitable for banquets, on account of their swallowing capabilities. It was such fun poking down their open throats with a bit of stick, first some chopped grass out of the mower's wheelbarrow, mixed with water, and then a soil pudding made from the hostess's own receipt.
"What shall we do now their throats is full?" asked Babs anxiously before the last course. "I'll be the doctor," said Teddy. "Do people ever have the doctor right in the middle of the dinner party?" "They might, if they were very ill." Rap, 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 on the trunk of the tree, and Mrs. Stoner, flushed and excited, admitted Dr. Teddy. And then they had a lovely time, peering into the snapdragons' throats, and pouring water down, and in extreme cases, extracting the tongues from the back of the flower. "It's just like us when we had sore throats," cried Babs, excitedly.
By the time the doctoring was done, some of the snapdragons were very languid and weak.
"They don't open their mouths quite so nice," said anxious Mrs. Stoner, stroking them tenderly with her fat brown fingers. "They're very bad still," pronounced the doctor gravely. "And this dear white one is all split." "Then it must be drowned," continued the medical man, whose measures were drastic. "Oh, Teddy," gasped the little girl, sympathetically. "Must it really?"
"Yes. We will go down to the brook with it now." So the tender little hostess bowed to the doctor's stern decree, and they set out across the field towards the brook with fatal purpose.
"Let me kiss it afore it goes?"
asked Babs, as they stood on the bridge. And then, after sad farewells, they solemnly dropped the ragged flower into the water. A moment's mournful silence ensued. "Let's paddle," suggested Teddy, chiefly to cheer Babs' drooping spirits at the snapdragon's decease. The thought of wading into the cool water on that hot morning filled the little girl with a sudden reaction of delight. They tore off their shoes and stockings, and ran about on the fresh grass before venturing into the brook.
"I's still Mrs. Stoner," said Babs. "I'm Henry Baker," announced Teddy.
The worst had happened, for there was nothing which filled poor Babs with greater terror than these sudden appearances of Henry Baker.
"Oh, please not, Teddy," she gasped. "Be a prince instead."
"Henry Baker is a wicked man," said Teddy, utterly unmoved by her appeal. "He cut all his children up in slices." The horror of this announcement was too much for Babs. In her hurry to reach dry land, she dropped her little bunch of petticoats and frock, trod on a sharp stone, and finally fell down in the soft red mud that lined the banks of the brook.
"What a mess!" observed Teddy, unsympathetically.
Babs looked extremely surprised for a few moments, and then, as if to complete the catastrophe, she began to splash violently with both hands. "You'd better come out," continued Teddy, as his sister sat resignedly in water several inches deep; and then, from a scientific point of view, "What does it feel like, Babs?"
"Rather cold in the water, and warmish in the mud,"
catching her breath. "Anything like hasty pudding would be?"
"Yes, something. On'y kite cold hasty pudding."
"More like porridge, perhaps?"
"Oh, yes," cried Babs, cheering up. "Just like porridge and lots of cold milk."
"You'd better go in," repeated Teddy, "'cause of catching cold."
"It's a horrid feeling," said Babs, as she scrambled up. "All heavy and dripping."
"It's horrider catching cold and stopping all day in bed," observed Teddy, wisely, and his little sister took the hint, and started to run towards the house as fast as she could in her wet, clinging clothes. Nana was a lovely nurse to go to in a mess. She never scolded at all, but put Babs into a nice warm bath, and dressed her in clean dry things, only muttering to herself every now and then, "Poor lambs! Gone to day, and here again to morrow," which remark Babs did not understand at all, and that cannot be wondered at, for to whom could it possibly apply? The children were not gone to day, and Granny, who was, would not be here again to morrow; or indeed, as Nana had said, ever again. Still, it seemed to relieve nurse's feelings, and that was the principal thing. One of the under maids had ventured to laugh at this saying of Nana's that same morning, but had been sternly rebuked for making jokes when Death was in the house. "It ain't in the house, anyway," she rudely retorted. "It's in the family, and that's the same thing," said nurse with dignity, as she left the room. Nana always spelt the family with a capital F. "Now, Miss Babs, dear," when the toilet was completed, "you'd better not go out again just at present. Wait till after dinner. There's a love." Ordinarily this prohibition would have raised a storm, but the little girl astonished nurse by saying, "All right," as she ran off into the day nursery. "It's as if the dear lamb's thoughts were in heaven too," said Nana, wiping away a tear. But she was mistaken. The dear lamb was thinking solely of some very interesting birds' eggs which she and Teddy were trying to hatch on the top of the hot water cistern. And for some time she had been trying to persuade him to let her make a hole in one of them with a pin, just to see how they were getting on, but in vain. This seemed a golden opportunity, for the children were nearly always together. So Babs started off to the attics, armed with a large pin to aid her research. "The egg is addled, Teddy," she announced at dinner. "How do you know?" asked her brother sharply. "I made just a teeny weeny hole in one with a pin, and I couldn't see nothing." "You'd no business to," said Teddy crossly. "Now you've spoilt that one. I told you not." "Oh, Teddy, I haven't killed the little bird?" she asked in an agony. "Yes, you have." Here nurse had to interfere, as Babs was almost in tears, and Teddy quite in a temper. "If there's any quarreling about it, I shall have to throw the whole lot away," she threatened, and the children were drawn together again by the bond of a common danger to their beloved property. 4 years ago, Major and Mrs. Conway went back to India, leaving their 2 children to live in the dear old country home with Granny. She did not know much about children, poor old lady, or perhaps she had forgotten what she once knew. It was so long since the Major and his younger brother were little boys in the Cloverdale nursery, and that dear dead daughter of hers a baby girl. And besides, she had latterly become a regular invalid, and could not do with the noise of childish voices and rough games. So Teddy and Babs had lived alone, going their own way and working out their own thoughts. Nana was very good in caring for their creature comforts, but she was rather old and fumbling too, and they had never known the joy of an under nurse, one of those scatter-brained, jovial village girls who work so badly and play so splendidly. So the children's chief and only playfellow had been the gardener, Giles. All day, every day, unless the weather was too bad, they spent out of doors, playing their quaint games and pretences, and growing with the birds and flowers in nature's big nursery, quite independently of the training and teaching which children usually have. A happy, sunshiny life it was, and Cloverdale the best, biggest home country in the world. But with just the same surroundings, the 2 children were entirely different in looks and ways and character. And it seemed as if there were a mistake somewhere, that Teddy should have been the girl, and Babs the boy. For Teddy had a sweet, fair face, framed in golden hair, his lovely mother's face, in fact, that ought to have been her daughter's. And Babs, poor Babs, was dark and square and sunburnt. A plain, cheerful child, full of the tenderest sensibilities, consumed by the most ardent feelings. While Teddy smiled an angel smile, and did not care much really about anything. "I will conjure this afternoon," announced the little boy magnanimously, and Babs' delighted excitement knew no bounds. The conjuring pigs were quite an institution in the Cloverdale nursery. They originally came out of a Noah's Ark, which Granny had given Teddy one far-away Christmas, and consequently were both exactly alike. "Where will you conjure to?" asked Babs, with the deepest interest.
I will conjure this one into the wheelbarrow on the lawn, hidden in the grass," said Teddy, with a lordly air. "Look, here it is in my hand. You see it? And touch it." "Yes,"
said his little sister, in an awe-stricken manner at the approach of so great a mystery.
"Well, look here. Be gone, pig. 1, 2, 3, and away!"
And he waved his closed hand wildly in the air.
"Now, Babs, go to the wheelbarrow and see if it's there."
Away flew little Barbara downstairs and out at the garden door. She buried both her fat hands into the mown grass, and sure enough, there lay a little wooden pig.
"Oh, Teddy!"
she screamed.
"Here it is! How wonderful you conjure! How do you do it?"
But her brother never would tell. He enjoyed her wondering admiration of his skill, and proceeded to electrify her still further by conjuring the pig back into the nursery cupboard.
"Again," she implored. "I's thought of a place this time, into the rabbit hutch."
But Teddy said the conjuring was over for that day, and Babs could not persuade him further. So they took all the young rabbits out in the orchard and played with them happily till tea time, when Nana arrived with the joyful announcement that they might have tea in the little tea things on the lawn. A slight squabble arose as to who should pour out, which was decided by a compromise suggested by Nurse. Babs should help the milk and sugar, and Teddy pour the tea. Tea in the little tea things always ended with a delightful game called Lappety, which consisted of a race between the children as to who could first drink a whole cup of milk, spooning it up with one of the tiny teaspoons. It was very exciting, as Babs in her hurry generally choked, and then Teddy got so far ahead that he was sure to win. On this occasion it ended more roughly still. The teapot was upset and the tray swam with a miscellany of slops, which fluid Teddy finally insisted that Babs should drink. The little girl obediently complied. She was accustomed from earliest youth to drink the leavings of a little tea things party, and had apparently quite acquired the taste. "Uncle Charlie's coming to see us soon," said Teddy. "Giles told me."
"Oh, how lovely!" cried Babs. "We haven't never seen him all our lives, have we?" "Of course not. He's been in India as well as father, but he came home when Granny went to London." "He'll be splendid, won't he, Teddy? A real INJA soldier."
A very favorite game of the children's was pretending to be father and Uncle Charlie. "I'm awful glad he's really coming," continued the boy, "'cause he's been in a proper battle, you know, Babs. Giles told me all about it, and got a medal from the Queen 'cause of it."
"Oh, yes, I know. Giles tells us lovely tales about Uncle Charlie." "I shall be a soldier too, Babs, of course." "Of course. But, Teddy, I wish father had been in a battle too. It makes it so much more of a soldier."
"He might have got killed," suggested Teddy.
"Oh, so he might. I'm awful glad now it was Uncle Charlie as was in the battle."
"And I am. His medal'll look lovely on his scarlet coat. Won't it, Babs?"
"Oh, lovely. When's he coming? I'm so 'cited 'bout it."
"One day quite soon, Giles says." "Master Teddy, Master Teddy," called Nana from the window, "I want you." The children rushed in and found Nurse poring over a little thin piece of pink paper which had come in an orange envelope. "I'm to take you up to London to morrow, Master Teddy dear, your uncle says." "What does it say?" asked Teddy, who could not quite manage to read writing yet. "Bring the boy here to morrow for funeral by 11 train to Paddington. Will meet you. Captain Conway." "Not me too?" cried Babs, with a dawning fear. "No, dearie," said Nana lovingly, "but we'll only be gone a day or two." "Oh, I would so have joyed the funeral," cried Babs. "Why didn't they want me to?" "There, there, Miss Dearie, don't fret. Funerals aren't nice for little girls," which sounded as if Nurse thought them delightful for everyone else. "I wish I was going too," continued Babs, wailing. But Nana came to the rescue with kisses of comfort, and suggested that the little girl should sail boats during her bath; and this was a stroke of genius on the part of Nurse. Bab's distress vanished as if by magic, and, judging from the shouts of laughter and splashing which emerged from the bathroom during her ablutions, the trouble was apparently quite forgotten. For happily children's sorrows, though perhaps as keen as those of their elders, are nothing like so long lived. Teddy was not nearly so excitable as his little sister, and took the news of his coming journey very calmly. He methodically set about packing his best top and paint box in case he wanted either of them at the funeral; and nurse attended to such details as clothes after the children were safe in bed. They both sat up till nearly 8 o'clock on this memorable occasion, and Babs was spared the anguish of that half hour which usually came after her bedtime and before her brother's.
"Teddy," she called, the last thing just before Nana shut the night nursery door, "s'pose the eggs hatch while you're away. What must I give them to eat?"
"Bread and milk," said Teddy.
"And just a few worms mixed with it? You remember how our last starling but one joyed bread and milk and worms?
Now, children, no more talking, or I shall have to shut Master Teddy's bedroom door."
"I's rather glad, after all, that I'll be home in case those eggs do hatch," murmured Babs to herself. "It would be so lonesome for the little ones without me for their mother."
And the dear little mother soul within her rejoiced that no pleasure of hers should interfere with her loving maternal duties. Which is the way of mothers. CHAPTER II. Uncle Charlie. But Teddy and Nana did not come back again soon. 4, 5 long summer days went by, and Babs was still alone at Cloverdale. She was enjoying herself immensely. It was such a treat going down to tea in the servants' hall, such fun helping Giles all day to garden, and listening to his thrilling conversation. Uncle Charlie was the never failing theme. Giles waxed so eloquent on the heroic conduct of British soldiers, and Babs caught his spirit and tone in a manner which even indulgent Nana would have noticed and rebuked. At last a letter came to cook, telling her to prepare for Captain Conway, who was coming down to Cloverdale that very night. It was very tiresome that he would not arrive till long after Babs was asleep, but on the following morning, directly she knew that he had gone downstairs, she rushed into the dining room in ecstatic anticipation of her introduction to this heroic soldier uncle. A slight, fair young man sat at the table, pouring out a cup of tea.
"Where's my soldier uncle?"
asked Babs, aghast, with an anxious little quaver in her voice.
"I want to see him."
Good gracious, is that really the girl? Thought Captain Conway, as he looked at the sturdy brown little maiden before him, and looked in vain for some likeness to that lovely, stately woman who was his brother's wife.
"I want my Uncle Charlie," she repeated impatiently. "You can go away, strange man."
"But look here, child, I am your Uncle Charlie. Don't you know me?" How could she have known him when he had been in India for the whole 5 years of her short life? But he could not think of anything else to say. This first appearance of his niece had so greatly disconcerted him. The boy was so pretty and graceful and taking that both his uncle and aunt were delighted with him. And Captain Conway had vaguely expected that when he went to Cloverdale a trim-looking maid would have brought to him a well-dressed, golden-haired, fairy kind of child who would have kissed him prettily, and lisped out some polite orthodox greeting; instead of which the door had been flung open, and transfixed at the sight of him, a square, brown, plain, untidy little creature had stood on the threshold, impatiently demanding that he should go away, and that her Uncle Charlie should come. "I am your Uncle Charlie." Then, as if to himself, imagine this being Barbara's child. To his great surprise, the little girl stamped her foot in a sudden frenzy of passion.
"Go away, nasty strange man," she repeated. "They told me my uncle was a soldier, and I's not a Barbara child. They calls me Babs."
"It is all right, I am a soldier," he said soothingly, "and I have come all this way, from London, to see you."
"I thought you'd be 'zactly like this,"
she explained, drawing nearer, and the smart young officer looked with amazement on a hideous advertisement for recruits, which portrayed a red-cheeked soldier blowing a trumpet.
"And Giles always says as the British soldier is the pride of the nation, and I was so glad my uncle was one, and now you are quite different, not a bit like a pride o' the nation, and no sword nor medal nor nothing," and she looked at him reproachfully. "Never mind about that,"
exclaimed her uncle. "I'm not dressed like a soldier to day. I've got lots of scarlet coats and swords in London, and you shall see them all, if you will be good." Bab's face brightened at this cheering news.
"And a trumpet and shield?"
she asked eagerly. "Yes, yes, everything," answered the Captain, with a slight disregard of the truth, and in the hope of diverting her. "Who is Giles?"
"I love Giles," said Babs, forgetting her disappointment. "He is Teddy's and my best friend, next to Nana. You see, Granny was generally ill. Giles said she's got the chronic, and since Teddy and Nana went to London I've lived in the garden and goin' about with Giles more'n ever, and we've had the loveliest talks, 'bout you, and the crops, and when the old pig'll be ready for killing. And I weed, and dig, and help Giles all day. Let me go now," continued the child, pulling away from his hand. "I shall just catch him while he's feeding the fowls."
"So that is the girl," thought the Captain, a vexed look sweeping over his face. "What a pity! But this running wild and being the companion of some farm labourer must be put a stop to. It is most unfortunate. She is not a bit like a gentleman's child, either to look at or to talk to. Fat brown legs, covered with scratches, filthy hands, hair that looks as if it had never been brushed or cut, frock fit for the workhouse, accent atrocious, manners and education entirely lacking." So the fastidious, dandified Captain reckoned up his small niece's enormities, and resolved that things should be very differently managed now the children were under his control. For Captain Conway and Mrs. Conway had decided to take Teddy and Babs home with them to London, and keep them until their parents came back from India, to settle in the old home at Cloverdale.
"I've 'splained to Giles about your being not a bit like a soldier to look at," said Babs on her return to the room a few minutes later. "And he says as elders and betters must be honoured in spite o' their looks, which, as they didn't make themselves, is no fault of their'n."
"Babs," exclaimed her uncle, "you really must not talk like that. It's not at all like a little lady." The brown eyes filled with tears, and an ominous pucker round the mouth caused Captain Conway to add hurriedly, "There, there, don't cry. Here's a new shilling for you." Babs brightened up in a moment, and took the peace offering with delight.
"I've never had so much money in my life afore," she said excitedly. "I never have nothing but pennies, 'cept the 3-penny bits on Sunday, which Giles says take as natural to the oft Tory bags as ducklings do to duck ponds."
Captain Conway sighed, but Babs went on cheerfully.
"I'd like to see you in your scarlet coat soon, with your spear and shield. Do you often kill people now, Uncle Charlie?"
"No, not often," laughed the young man.
"Only wicked people, I s'pose?"
"Not anybody at all." Babs looked woefully disappointed, until a fresh thought suddenly diverted her.
"May I crack your egg for you? Do let me. I can do it so nice."
As her uncle was afraid of vexing her again, he resignedly acquiesced.
"There's always a chance in finding a chicken in it, you see," she continued. "That's what makes eggs so interesting for breakfast. We only have them on Sundays, so we only get very few chances."
"Have you got any real chickens out of doors?"
"Oh, yes, splendid ones. All the bantams are mine, and the others Teddy's."
"I'm afraid you are very fond of the country," said her uncle, trying to picture this wild out of door child shut up in a London nursery.
"What are you 'fraid of in the country?" she asked. "The cows?" "I'm not a bit 'fraid of them, and I milk the dear white one sometimes, when Giles holds her tail. I can't bear it to come whiskin' round."
"And have you got any dogs or cats?"
"Why, of course we have. I love Soot, the cat, better than any one in the whole world, 'cept Teddy and Nana, and Giles, and father and mother in INJA. She hasn't had any more kittens lately. It seems a longer time than generally is since she had any. Poor thing! Her kittens hardly ever lived to grow up, but Giles says that cats have a sight of trouble in that way."
"And what dogs?"
"Oh, Sheepy and Toby and Dash. Dear Don died last week, or p'raps it was last year, I forget. Mrs. Forrester gived us Toby."
"Who is Mrs. Forrester?"
"Don't you know? Why, Jane's aunt, the laundry maid, you know. She lives in the village, and her niece, 'Lisabeth Lamb, lives with her, who has got the decline. Mrs. Forrester gived a party the day after Nana and Teddy went to London, and I went and Jane and Giles. I did 'joy myself. Giles wore his Sunday coat, and Mrs. Forrester only cried twice."
"Does Mrs. Forrester often cry?" asked the Captain, who could not help being amused by this torrent of talk.
"Oh, generally. You know she has to every time she sees Mr. Forrester's funeral card, what's framed, and you can't help seeing it pretty often 'cause of its being over the chimney piece. It gives her a turn, she always says, but Giles thinks her reservoirs leak."
Then, seeing him put his cup down, she added hurriedly,
"Do you want some more tea now? Let me pour it, please."
"You can pour the cream in. The teapot is too hot and too heavy."
"I saw a pillow case in the garden this morning," continued Babs when the new tea was ready.
"A what?"
"A pillow case. You know, what crawls."
"I don't understand you. What was it like?" Her uncle could not imagine what she meant.
"It was brown and furry and creepy, like a velvet worm."
"You mean a caterpillar."
"Oh, yes, that's it. I knew there was a pillow in it somewhere. On wet days I see black snails, too. Mrs. Forrester wants 'Lisabeth Lamb to swallow black snails for her decline, but she won't, never."
"She's right there," laughed the Captain.
"Now you've finished your breakfast, shall we go out?"
asked Babs, confidingly slipping her hand into her uncle's.
"I can show you the garden, you know."
"All right. Only bring me a match first." But Captain Conway could not get over his little niece's personal appearance. He had always felt so sure that Barbara's daughter would be a beauty, and both he and his pretty, empty headed wife had been influenced in their idea of taking the children to live with them for a while by such poor thin thoughts as these. A lovely, well dressed little girl, seated beside her aunt in the victoria, a sweet, gentle plaything for dull afternoons, a striking little couple to introduce into children's parties. The boy was the heir, so his appearance did not matter much, still it was a great pleasure to find him so handsome and taking. But the girl! Silly Aunt Elinor was quite looking forward to showing off her pretty little niece, to taking her out with her, and dressing her exquisitely. And Captain Conway was thinking of all this when he looked at Babs. He was young and silly also. Accustomed to talk by the hour about a woman's points, and the fit of her frock, and how she looked, and walked, and rode, and danced. And he, too, had never imagined such a catastrophe as a plain relation. His mother had been a beauty. His wife was one, of course. His sister-in-law was really lovely, and his niece, she who was to take the place which a little daughter of his own would have filled, was quite the plainest, most common-looking child he had ever noticed. At least so he decided in his impatient disappointment. Her shrill, quaint talk was certainly amusing now in the Cloverdale garden, but her uncle shuddered at the thought of Giles or Elizabeth Lamb and her decline being mentioned with that accent in the Onslow Square drawing room. A governess must be immediately procured. "Can you read?" he asked suddenly, a question suggested by the idea of the governess. Babs was lying flat on her face in the grass, trying to see down a mole hole.
"Only a bit," she answered, adding gaily, "Teddy can kite well, and he makes poetry, too, splendid poetry. Shall I tell you his best piece?"
"By all means," said the Captain, lighting another cigarette. Babs folded her grimy fingers and repeated the following remarkable verse:
"Let's learn Latin, vouchsafe. Learn it quickly as you can." And he dashed the sparkling water at the feet of Mary Ann. Isn't that a splendid one?"
The Captain laughed. "What do you mean by vouchsafe?" he asked.
"He's Teddy's favourite man in church. Don't you know what we sing about? He comes near the end of a rather long singin', and Teddy and I always listen out for him, but he's Teddy's favourite. Mine in church is Harry Luja, but he only comes sometimes."
"Do you like going to church?"
"Oh, yes, all 'cept the beseeches. But I made a piece of poetry, too, only it's not such a nice one. It's There was a little girl, and she had a yellow frock, and she had a pella-lock."
"That's a very nice one," said Uncle Charlie, "only I don't quite know what a pella-lock is." Babs looked rather doubtful.
"A lock is what's in the doors, you see, and my little Marys cover them."
"Your little what?"
"My little Marys, I call them. They're rather like wooden people, and the key pushes them aside. I kiss them often."
"This is a most remarkable specimen," thought the Captain, as Babs rushed off in pursuit of a butterfly. "I never heard such a rigmarole in my life. They must be most extraordinary children." But there Captain Conway showed his ignorance of children. Teddy and Babs only thought and talked and lived as thousands of other imaginative children do, in the happy interesting world of pretense. Uncle Charlie had made the mistake in thinking that the children would be big dolls, so of course he was astonished to find that they were really little men and women. "Babs," he called, sitting down on a garden seat, "would you like me to take you to Teddy in London, and to see your Aunt Elinor? The sooner she's in a civilized atmosphere the better," he thought to himself. But apparently Babs did not hear him. She was dancing excitedly round and round a small object on the path, and screaming, "My cater! My cater!" with a great delight. Uncle Charlie perceived that she had again met with her friend the caterpillar. "Babs," he repeated, "would you like me to take you to London?"
"Oh, yes!" cried the child, diverted directly. "I want to go to London awful much. Giles has told me all 'bout it."
"Well, we'll go to morrow. One of the housemaids can take you."
"But you said you'd take me."
"So I will, but you'd go in another carriage, you see."
"How funny!"
laughed Babs.
"Will there be more'n one carriage? It'll be a nice surprise for Nana and Teddy when I come. I like you, Uncle Charlie, much better'n I did at first," she continued earnestly, "though you see, you are rather a 'pointment to me, when I 'spected a fat soldier with a trumpet. But Giles says use is second nature, and I guess we got used to each other. Was I a 'pointment to you, Uncle Charlie?"
"Suppose I expected a fair little girl with golden hair and blue eyes," said the Captain, reverting to his late vision.
"Oh, Uncle Charlie, did you really?"
she cried. And there was a pathos in her tone that drowned the provincial accent, and caused her uncle to kiss her hurriedly, and suggest a visit to Giles to tell him of her journey to London, which happily diverted Babs for the moment. But alas! the created thought lived on in the child's soul. The next morning all was bustle and confusion, quite a new experience to Babs. The servants kept kissing her whenever they met her, instead of telling her not to bother, and after she had gone old Giles' tears fell fast on the geranium plant which he was trying to pot. Babs could not understand why everyone at Cloverdale made such a sudden fuss about her. She was only going to London, just to find Teddy and her Aunt Elinor. She had no idea that the dear old home was to be shut up, and nearly all the servants sent away, until that far away, unreal father and mother of hers came back from India, and nobody quite knew when that would be.
"Take care of the eggs, be sure," she said the last thing, as the servants stood waving their hands, and the final piece of luggage was being put on to the carriage. "And if the little birds come while I'm away, be very kind to them, and don't punish them, even if they do wrong. Good-bye, dear Giles. Good-bye."
"Thank heaven that is over without a storm of tears," thought Uncle Charlie, with a sigh of relief, as he watched Babs pointing out to a wretched little Dutch doll all the beauties of the scenery on the road, with the brightest possible face. "What a mercy she doesn't mind about going. I was afraid she would have fretted awfully." It did not strike Uncle Charlie that she did not understand that she was really leaving her old home for a time; and that, as a child, she was incapable of looking beyond the near horizon of the hour. The immediate interests of first the drive to the station, and then the long railway journey, entirely filled her mind. The excitement of sandwiches in the train, and then of waking after a long sleep, still to find herself rushing along through the country, drove all thoughts of the home left behind out of her head. She could not remember much about the journey after to tell Teddy; it left a confusion of impressions which she could not disentangle. She was rather sleepy, too, when they at last left the train, and she took little notice of the drive through the streets to Onslow Square. Nana and Teddy were in the hall of the strange house, and the old nurse snatched up her darling and carried her straight off upstairs, such a long, long way up to a funny small nursery, where nice bread and milk was ready, and a cozy cot beside Nana's bed. Aunt Elinor was out just then, and it was too high up for her to go to the nursery afterwards to see her new little niece. "You had better know the worst at once, Nora," said her husband, as they sat down to dinner that night. "She is an awfully plain, rough, wild little creature, not half as nicely behaved as the boy. I can't believe she's Barbara's child."
"Oh, what a pity! I don't like any children much, and I detest rough, naughty ones. We must get a governess at once. That silly old nurse spoils them frightfully, I can see."
"She's a clever little thing, though. She kept me amused the whole of yesterday."
"Clever? Worse and worse, Charlie. I do hate a clever plain girl more than I can tell you. Oh, I do wish she had been a doll. I've told such a lot of people about the little niece that I'm going to have, and now I shall be ashamed to show her, from what you say."
"Yes, you will, I'm afraid. But she can live in a nursery."
"Good gracious, yes. I shan't bother with her. If she'd been like Barbara now, I would have taken her about with me, and it would have been fun to have dressed her. I like the look of a pretty little girl in a victoria. People would have thought she was my own who saw us driving. Do I look old enough, Charlie, to have a daughter of 5?
"Rather not. But really I am sorry about the child, though it can't be helped. It is still more vexing for Ned and Barbara than for us. We'd better have the child photographed and send it out to them, to break it to them gently." And poor little Babs was dreaming of the big, bright home behind her, utterly unconscious of the new, narrow life which she was to live in the sunless atmosphere of her uncle and aunt's selfish life. CHAPTER III. In London.
"London isn't nearly as big as the country,"
said Babs one day, pressing her nose flat against the window.
"How do you know?"
asked Teddy.
"By looking, of course. At home we could see the garden, then the field, and the woods and the hills ever so far away, what was generally bluish. And here you just see nothing but the streets, and there's no far away at all."
"I like London," said Teddy, "'cause you see soldiers sometimes, and it's fun driving in the park."
"I've never drived in the park yet," announced Babs rather mournfully. "And I don't like always going walks and wearing gloves."
"Gloves are horrid," agreed her brother.
"And Aunt Elinor says I must always wear them,"
very sadly.
"And it's so hot. My fingers is all sticky and tight in them."
"There seems more children in London than the country," Teddy thought.
"But we don't never play with them. I asked Aunt Elinor if I mightn't play with some of them in Kensington Gardens, and she said certainly not, or I'd catch something."
"What?" asked Teddy.
"She didn't say. But it seems a pity not to play when there are such lots of children." "Now, Miss Babs, dear," called Nana, "come and have your things on, and we'll go for a walk. Wace is coming, too."
Wace was Aunt Elinor's maid. Babs was a very different looking child now to what she used to be at Cloverdale. No comfortable dirty pinafore was allowed in London, but a clean white frock with a wide black sash. Thin shiny shoes and silk stockings instead of the old thick boots and cotton socks. And a big hat trimmed very smartly on the top of her well brushed hair. But Aunt Elinor still thought her woefully plain, and took far more notice of pretty Teddy, who looked charming in his new sailor suits. "Let's go up to the park," said Teddy, as they started out.
"Oh, yes,"
cried Babs enthusiastically, "'cause we might see the soldiers." Soldiers are one of the few things in London that really attract the attention of children. In the country they noticed almost everything they see; but in London probably the mass of objects prevent most of them from being individualized, and children walk along apparently unconscious of the vast stream of traffic. The army of horses, the endless number of people, the 1,000 objects in fact that line one's way through London. Every now and then they noticed a really interesting thing, such as a watering cart, or a barrel organ, especially if crowned by a monkey, or above all things, the ordinary London cat. That is always exciting, whether asleep on the area steps, or peeping through the railings, or taking a constitutional walk, or chatting with a neighbor. A child will never pass by a cat without seeing it, feeling a personal interest in it, and probably hanging behind on the nurse's hand to get a last look at so dear a feline friend. Teddy and Babs were no exception to the rule. They walked up Queen's Gate and saw hardly anything therein. A man mending a lamp post at last attracted Teddy's attention, and he and Babs suddenly developed an interest in lamp posts.
"Do you think he's the man that turns out the London gas in the morning?" said Babs. "Oh, I would like to ask him."
"Come along, Miss Babs, dear," called nurse. Just then they saw a really very entertaining thing. A sparrow flying along with a huge straw in its mouth, which instantly produced in Babs a perfect frenzy of delight.
"Oh, look, look!" she cried. "Nana, Wace, do look at that dear little bird what has got the straw. I 'specs he's going to build a nest like the birds do in the country. Where do you think he lives?"
"Somewhere quite near, Miss Babs," said Wace. "Very likely in that tree."
"Do you think he's the one I hear chirping in the mornings?" asked the child.
"Bless her little heart!" ejaculated nurse. Poor Nana found London rather tiring after the peaceful rest of Cloverdale, and moreover she was always longing for the big garden for the children to play in. "Squares, indeed!" she had scornfully observed. "They be but poor shoddy imitations of real gardens." Teddy and Babs were talking about the sparrow, when Wace called their attention excitedly. "Look, Miss Babs and Master Teddy! There is the Prince of Wales." Teddy looked hurriedly at a passing omnibus, and Babs straight up in the air, as if she were hoping to see the Princess in a balloon. By the time their attention was properly directed, they succeeded in catching sight of the back of a far distant carriage, and were not suitably impressed. Then they crossed over into the park, and Teddy and Babs began to run. Teddy was a soldier on a horse, one of those dear ones that the Life Guards ride. His black trousers carried out that idea, and his hat on one side made a splendid soldier, and Babs was a train. It must have been warm work rushing about in the sun on a broiling June day, in addition to keeping up a perpetual puffing and blowing, but that was of course necessary to the idea of the train. By and by the sound of distant music and gleam of far off colour intimated that the soldiers were really coming up Queen's Gate, on their way back to the Knightsbridge Barracks. Shrieks of delight from Babs attracted the amused attention of several passers by.
"How lovely they was!" she said when the show was over. "I like the soldiers better than anything in London."
"Of course I do," agreed Teddy.
"Uncle Charlie is not so much of a soldier as we fought, is he, Teddy? I've never seen him like one yet."
"You forget his medal, Babs."
"I s'pose so. But when a man's never a thing you forget what he really is," said the little girl lucidly.
"He is going to a regimental dinner to night, and he will wear his soldier things."
"I like soldiers what fights better than those that only go out to dinner."
"I like both kinds," said Teddy, who had a well-regulated masculine mind.
"Let's find things," suggested Babs,
and that was a game which never fell flat. Such wonderful treasures they found in Kensington Gardens. A broken bit of shell on the pathway, the outside of a horse chestnut under the trees, a piece of fancy grass that was growing, and 100 other things which none but children's eyes would have noticed, and which would have brought pleasure to none but children's souls. The morning was gone in no time, and Babs and Teddy were surprised when Nana said it was time to go home to dinner. And there a new treat awaited them. A lady had written to ask Aunt Elinor to bring the children to a garden party she was giving that afternoon. "Will you be good if I take you?" her aunt asked Babs. There was generally a gritty sound in Aunt Elinor's voice when she spoke to her little niece. She was always irritated with the child for not being pretty, and she never tried to understand Babs' eager original nature. She did not mean to be actually unkind, only she was utterly ignorant of how great a depth of sympathy and knowledge is needed by those who have the care of little children.
"Oh, I will be good, I promise," said Babs excitedly. "I won't do nothing at all naughty."
"Very well. Now go and tell nurse to dress you in your very best." At 4:00 they started in the carriage, to the children's keen delight. Babs chattered unceasingly.
"Do you think they remembers to feed all the omnibus horses?" she asked. Oh, look, Teddy! As that old man getting up that omnibus. He minds me so much of Giles."
"Don't point, Babs," said her aunt sharply. "That is not behaving at all well."
"I'm so sorry. I didn't know,"
said Babs, with a cloud over her bright face.
"But how do you make people see things if you don't point?"
Aunt Elinor could not bear the trouble of answering children's questions. "Do be quiet a bit," she said testily. And a 10-second silence ensued.
"Wace's young man used to conduct in an omnibus," began the little girl again, "but he left to better himself."
"What an awful child she is," thought Aunt Elinor. "I wish I had only brought Teddy." But Babs was quite unconscious of her crimes. Happily the drive soon came to an end, and directly they were safe inside the garden Aunt Elinor forgot all about the children, and went off with several friends, whom she had not seen during the whole dreary month in which she had been obliged to mourn for her husband's mother. Teddy too behaved rather shabbily to Babs. The hostess brought 2 little boys to play with him, and after staring at each other for a while, after the manner of children, the bigger of the 2 observed, "Come on." And Teddy went, leaving his sister alone on the terrace. But Babs was a dear sunny little soul, who was wont to make the best of everything, and though her childish spirits sank at the sad experience of not being a big boy like Teddy, she soon cheered up and began to talk to a nice lady with a kind face, who had seen the baby tragedy, and was full of sympathy for the little girl. "Would you like some strawberries, dear?" she asked, and Babs' face brightened wonderfully as she slipped her hand into that of her new friend.
"I've never been to a real grown-up party afore," she said confidingly, "'cause we lived in a country always."
"I expect you like the country better than London," said the lady.
"I likes them both, but the country is my favourite. You see, in London I have to wear gloves, and it matters 'bout not being pretty. I never knowed in the country that I wasn't." The lady looked quite sad all in a minute, and Babs thought there were tears in her eyes. "Where's your mother, dear?" she asked gently. "In INJA. She's coming home soon. I've never seed my mother nor father, and Teddy has forgotten them, but Nana remembers them."
"I'm so glad she is coming," said the lady. "I used to live in the country too, but that was a long time ago."
"When you was in your last place?"
suggested Babs. The lady laughed. "Yes, darling," she said. "And now tell me if your little brother is kind to you."
"Oh, yes. We always play together, unless," and her face clouded over again, "unless there's any bigger children what makes me too little."
"You'll be bigger some day, you know."
"It'll never be no good," continued Babs mournfully, "'cause when I's 7, he'll be 9."
"Never mind that. Have some more strawberries, or a piece of cake."
"I aren't messing at all, are I?" asked the little girl anxiously, "'cause I promised Aunt Elinor I'd be good."
"You are very good, dear," said the lady.
"Yesterday was a bad day for Uncle Charlie,"
began Babs, when the cake was finished, and she had gone with her new friend for a walk round the garden.
"His best shirts were messed in the wash. Teddy and I was playing after tea, and he was so happy in the passage when all of a sudden Uncle Charlie came out of his dressing room with a crumpled shirt, and he was so angry as a lion what has missed a person."
"Here is a swing," said the lady, smiling at these domestic revelations. "Would you like to get on it?"
"Oh, yes!"
screamed Babs, to whom the swing was a dear country sight. "I'll swing you," said the lady.
"Oh, no! Don't touch me. I can do it all right. We had a swing at Cloverdale. Look!"
As the swing began to move in obedience to her extreme efforts.
"I are quite a little acrobat."
The lady laughed again. "You are indeed," she said. "But you will get so hot. Let me swing you now." So Babs had a lovely swing.
"I are 'joying myself,"
she said in a glad little voice. "Is your country home very far away?" asked her friend.
"Oh, yes. Thousands of miles. There was a stone in the road what said 195 miles to London. Would that mean this London, do you think?"
"Yes, dear."
"Well, it was all that far away. We'll go home again some day when father and mother in INJA come, if there's a train to take us."
"There will certainly be a train," the lady assured her. Just then a young man joined them. "How are you, Mrs. Allison? I didn't know you were here. And what a very nice person you have got to talk to." "She is quite splendid." Then to Babs, "This gentleman likes little girls." "On'y pretty ones?" asked Babs, pathetically. "Only fat, happy, funny ones," said the young man. "Just like you."
"That's a good thing," laughed Babs. "I are quite fat, and shall I show you what makes me happy?"
"Yes, do. What is it?" Babs turned out her tiny pocket. It contained a clean pocket handkerchief and a small paper parcel. She opened the paper and proudly displayed what was apparently a bit of meat.
"It's the tip of a tongue," she explained. "Teddy and I got one for luck, you know. Cook gived it to us, and sometimes I carry it and sometimes he does. It brought us the soldiers this morning, and a party this afternoon. One tip lasts 'bout a fortnight. But if you wear cotton frocks you have to be very careful to remember to take it out of your pocket afore it's sent to the wash." "That's a good superstition," said the young man to the lady, and then they both laughed. "You're a rum little creature," he said to Babs. "Will anyone be wanting you, dear?" asked the lady. "I think we had better go back to the terrace." "Oh, yes, p'raps Aunt Elinor and Teddy."
"Is the party over?" in a doleful tone. "Well, it is, nearly. I am going home now." "And I am," added the young man. "Good gracious, child, where have you been?" exclaimed Aunt Elinor impatiently; and then seeing Mrs. Allison, "I hope my little niece hasn't been boring you." "Oh, no," said the lady, "I like her." And as Aunt Elinor hurried away with the children, Mrs. Allison said to the young man, "Aunt Elinor would have bored me to death in 5 minutes, but that nice little niece of hers, never."
"Good bye, kind lady," said Babs, running back and holding up her face for a kiss. "I hope I'll see you every day."
"Good bye," called the young man. "What is your name? You never told me."
"Curdy,"
shouted Babs as her aunt called her. For Mrs. Conway's carriage stopped the way.
"A most ordinary thing happened to me," began the little girl as they drove off. "A gentleman spoke to me what I did not know. He asked me my name, but I thought I had better not tell him, so I said Curdy."
"How silly you are," said Aunt Elinor. "Were those 2 nice little boys?" to Teddy.
"Middlin'," answered Teddy. "They're going to school soon. When am I going to school, Auntie?"
"When you know a little more. A governess is coming for you and Babs on Monday, and then we shall see how you get on."
"Shall I go to Eton school like those other boys?"
"I expect so. But your father will decide when he comes home."
"What'll I do when Teddy goes to school?"
asked Babs with a dawning fear. But nobody took the trouble to answer her. Teddy was thinking of the new world of school, and Aunt Elinor was nodding to a friend. When they reached home it was almost the children's bedtime, but they were so anxious to see Uncle Charlie dressed in his soldier things that they were allowed to stay downstairs. Aunt Elinor put on a tea gown and threw herself down on the sofa. "I feel wretchedly ill," she exclaimed petulantly. "These hot days give me such a headache."
"Do you think you'll get better, or die?"
asked Babs with interest. "She is the most unfeeling child I ever saw," thought her aunt. But aloud she said snappishly, "Of course I shall get better."
"I'm so glad."
Just then a telegram was brought in asking Mrs. Conway to dine with some people in a friendly way, and go with them to their box at the opera afterwards. The headache vanished as if by magic. She, poor pleasure loving soul, was only sick of stopping at home; and she rushed upstairs to dress in the greatest delight. Uncle Charlie came down first, and the children danced round him in a perfect ecstasy.
"How lovely you look!" cried Babs. "A regular pride o' the nation."
"And your medal on, too," said Teddy. "Why don't you wear it always?" "A handsome," said their uncle to the butler, while Babs was stroking his sleeve and kissing his sword. "Good night, little people," patting their heads. Uncle Charlie always treated the children as if they were dogs; not prize ones, of course, but nice commonplace dogs, who occasionally were brought out of their kennels for a treat.
"I likes Uncle Charlie better than Aunt Elinor,"
said Babs, as the hansom drove away.
"And I do,"
agreed Teddy, "'cause he's a soldier."
"And kinder," added the little girl.
"Oh!" This last remark had reference to their aunt, whom they now saw in evening dress for the first time. She had not been to a party since they came, besides they were always in bed before her dinner time. She really did look beautiful. The jetted black dress showed off the fairness of her complexion, and diamonds flashed in her golden hair.
"You're as lovely as a fairy," said Teddy, admiringly, "or an angel."
Aunt Elinor kissed him and looked pleased.
"How splendid you do look!" exclaimed Babs, after a deep drawn breath. "Giles always said Uncle Charlie had married one as would be more for ornament than use, and you are, aren't you?"
Her aunt's pretty face quite changed. "How often am I to forbid you to repeat that odious old Giles chatter?" she said angrily. For the exact reproduction of the old gardener's accent was most offensive to her fastidious ears, and besides, the vulgar truth of his saying was hardly palatable. The child's bright happy look faded. It was rather a sad little Babs that waved her good night from the window. Sad thoughts had begun to come to the little girl in this new life of hers. She knew she continually vexed her aunt, and yet at the same time she was unconscious of any wrong. She read the impatience of Aunt Elinor's tone, and the disapprobation of her glance in the midst of the merriest play; and exceeding bitter once was her cry, "All the little girls are pretty 'cept me," after she had seen her aunt lavishing admiration and petting on Lady Everley's golden haired, doll faced children. And yet she bore no grudge against Aunt Elinor, nor yet against Teddy, whom both uncle and aunt so obviously preferred. Few people who saw this commonplace, sturdy little maiden would have guessed the depth and beauty of her fair child soul. CHAPTER IV. Nursery Life. It was very different playing in the London nursery, far away up so many stairs, and shut in even from the interests of the landing by a little wooden gate that Teddy could not open, much less Babs, to having the big old house and glorious garden at Cloverdale all to themselves. There were no delightful corners in this stiff, straight room wherein the children could crouch and bump their heads and enjoy themselves in 100 enchanting imaginary ways. No beautiful cupboards in which to hide, nor sofa arms to ride upon, as there were in the dear old nursery at home. But the children accepted the existing as the inevitable, in which they were wiser than some of their elders, and made the best of their new cramped quarters.
"If there isn't room enough for hare and hounds, there is for giving a party," said Babs brightly. "Will you give one, or shall I, Teddy?" "I will," answered Teddy, "only we must ask Nana for things to eat." "You might live in the night nursery," suggested Babs, "and then I could come to the party quite proper." "And you wouldn't know what there was to eat till you arrived," said Teddy. "That's like a real party." "It's a bit dull for me while you is getting it ready," complained Babs. "Couldn't I pretend I was your cook, just till it was ready for the party to arrive?"
"Would you forget you knew, and be very surprised?" asked Teddy doubtfully.
"Oh, I would, I promise," pleaded Babs.
So she was allowed to assist in the preparation of the great feast. The pity of it was that they could not go down into the kitchen here as they would have done at Cloverdale, to coax really splendid eatables, such as a handful of currants and a piece of candied peel, out of the good natured old cook. They had to be content with what Nana would give them, but it was a lovely feast all the same, in spite of rather a scarceness of provisions. It was laid out in a little dinner set belonging to Babs, instead of the usual tea set, because, as Teddy said, "The things we've got to eat are more dinnery than tea-ish." 2 glass decanters were filled with water tinged pink by the introduction of a little tooth powder, of which the mixture Babs was very proud.
"It makes a splendid wine,"
she screamed, clapping her hands. 2 cough lozenges made a show at one end of the table, and a piece of licorice, cut up with the scissors out of Nana's work basket, at the other. A dish of brown sugar, well moistened with warm water, made an attractive sweet, but the crowning glory of the feast was a pile of camphor pills borrowed from Nana on the understanding that neither of the children would eat them. Babs could not resist just touching one with her tongue, but it very quickly dried again, and Nana never knew.
"Good morning, Captain Teddy," said the little visitor pleasantly on her admission.
She looked quite gorgeous in a nightcap of Nana's, and an antimacassar over her shoulders. "Good morning, Mrs. Babs," solemnly replied Teddy, who had a black corked mustache and whiskers.
"How do you do, and how are your children?" continued the lady vivaciously.
"Quite well, thank you, ma'am. And how are yours?" Teddy was never so good at originating conversation as Babs.
"One of them is dead," answered the visitor cheerfully. "Her head came off this morning when I dropped her. I have brought my best daughter with me, you see," and she displayed with pride her last new doll.
"Take a seat," said Teddy, in a gruff voice. Babs sat down at the table, which was not a table at all, but the lower half of her high chair, which unscrewed in the middle, and the feast began.
"The cough lozenges taste of having a cold. I don't like them,"
said Babs, forgetting her party manners.
"It is very rude to say so,"
observed Teddy, looking rather cross.
"Oh, I beg your pardon,"
exclaimed Babs, who never wished to vex her brother. She would have said, "I sorry," if she had not been Mrs. Babs out at a party. Teddy was carving the licorice, and did not reply.
"You ought to say granted, like Mrs. Forrester used," said the little girl. "It's manners."
"The visitor oughtn't to tell the gentleman that's giving the party what to say," argued Teddy. Babs hastily changed the subject.
"Dear Captain Teddy," she said in a funny, grave voice, "might I trouble you for another help of that 'licious sugar slop?"
Peace was instantly restored, and the feast finished without another hitch.
"The tooth powder wine is a little bitter,"
Teddy observed on his own account, but he drained the last drop manfully. The London nursery did quite nicely, too, for playing rabbits in.
"We was always wild rabbits at Cloverdale, but we can be tame ones here like our own ones in the pen at home,"
suggested Babs. And so, pretending to be rabbits would not have been spoiled at all, if Nana had not mentioned the fact that Babs' black silk stockings would wear out at the knees, and then Aunt Elinor was very cross and forbade any more creeping on hands and knees. That was a dire disappointment to Babs, because creeping was so much nicer and more interesting than just dull walking properly. To make up, kind Nana sometimes let them play rabbits at night in bed, where they could creep and burrow, and it was altogether delightful. But the chief game which the children played in London was that of the toy people. They could not continue the stoner romance at all well in such a small room, and besides, the stoners had stayed at Cloverdale. So they turned their pretending life into that of the toy people, who lived for the most part in brick houses built on the Ottoman, and had themselves all originally sprung from sundry Noah's Arks. There were 4 great families of them: the Reds, the Yellows, the Browns, and the Blues, and each family consisted of a big Mr. and Mrs., who were the grandparents, a little Mr. and Mrs., who were the parents, and such children as the remainder of the Noah's Ark supplied. Of course the families were not at all intact. For instance, big Mrs. Yellow had found an early grave down a grating in the Cloverdale garden, from which there was no possibility of rescue, and little Mrs. Brown had met with a violent death in the jaws of Don the retriever. A very awkward thing, too, had happened to one of the young Yellows. Babs dropped him by mistake into the bath, and when the water was wiped off him, the Yellow came off too, so he became an outcast from his family, and took a situation as White, the footman, in a distinguished family called Violet, which belonged to Teddy. Not of Noah's Ark origin were these, but out of a most aristocratic toy box. The Violets had figures and features of their own, and were consequently called Lord and Lady by the admiring children. It was rather a sore point with Babs that Teddy insisted on "doing" for the Violets entirely. It seemed so cheerless to the little girl to be thus shut out of their stately home. Occasionally the original families were broken up, and a coalition household formed; but the most popular game was in the varied fortunes of the 4 families themselves. Babs' favourite person was a dear grown-up daughter of the Yellows, aged 16, and the child loved that thin bit of painted wood called Annie Yellow, with a love that her mother was hungry for away in India. On week days the toy children all attended a school kept by big Mr. Brown, and on Sundays Teddy built a beautiful church, and Babs had splendid fun making Dicky Blue behave badly, or laying little Mrs. Red low with a sudden and dangerous complaint called the rheumatic 'sterics. One day a terrible thing happened. When the children were putting away the toy people, Jane Red was missing. High and low they searched, but in vain.
"I can't sleep for thinking of poor Jane,"
said Babs, after she had been in bed about 3 minutes.
"Never mind, dearie,"
said Nana soothingly. "We'll find her to-morrow, all right." So Bab's sleepless night of anxiety came to an end before Nana went to her supper, though the little girl's first thought in the morning was for the missing toy maiden. And, sad to relate, the nursery maid in sweeping had found the unhappy Jane under the ottoman with her head severed from her body. "She's quite dead," said Babs sadly. "We must have a funeral then," suggested Teddy, and this exciting idea instantly raised Bab's spirits. The coal box was selected as a suitable tomb, and thither the defunct Jane was solemnly borne, wrapped up in a bit of newspaper. As an appropriate dirge, Teddy sang "Rosalie the Prairie Flower," Babs joining in where she knew the words. When the excitement of the obsequies had abated, Teddy still further rejoiced Bab's soul by intimating that the Red family must go into mourning, and, after a little coaxing, Nurse lent them a pen and ink, with which they proceeded to make a black girdle round all the principal Reds and their collaterals. "I'm glad Jane was killed," announced heartless Teddy, the pen and ink proved so enthralling. "Oh, Teddy!" exclaimed Babs reproachfully. "How can you? But still, now she is dead, all this busyness keeps us from frettin'. But I'm 'fraid Alice Blue will miss her very bad." "They always were friends, I know," said Teddy solemnly. "P'raps Alice might have mourning too," suggested Babs brightly, when the Reds were all dry. That was a very happy thought, and Teddy delighted his little sister's soul by allowing her to do Alice all by herself, which resulted in a few blots and stains on frock and hands, but an amount of bliss which far outweighed such trifles. "I think it 'ud be nice for the Reds to have another child to make up for poor Jane," observed Babs, regarding the stricken family on the table. "And I've got a thought, Teddy." "What is it?" asked her brother. "You know White, the Violet's footman? Mightn't we dip him in the red ink what's in the library, and make him a new son for little Mr. and Mrs. Red?" "Do you think Uncle Charlie would let us?" "Aunt Elinor wouldn't, but Uncle Charlie might if we asked him as a great treat." "Anyhow, we can try," said Teddy; and hand in hand the solemn little couple trotted down the long staircase and gently knocked at the library door. Uncle Charlie was yawning just then. He had finished smoking, at least as much as he ever finished, and his letters were written, and there were no books to read, that is, no yellow backs, which were Uncle Charlie's idea of books. And it was raining. And there was a whole hour to get through before he went down to the club. He was just wondering whatever he could do to amuse himself, when the children's rap attracted his attention. It was a most propitious moment for Teddy and Babs. "What do you want, youngsters?" Uncle Charlie asked, smiling. "Oh, please," they began in one breath, and then Babs finished, "might we dip the footman in your red ink?" Uncle Charlie looked amused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It's like this," continued Babs earnestly, and their funny sober faces made Uncle Charlie laugh. "The Reds have lost their daughter Jane, what died under the ottoman in the night, and we think a new grown up sound would cheer them up, poor things." "Yes, poor things," chimed in Teddy. "I'll tell the rest, Babs. So we want you please to let us dip White, the Violet's footman, in your red ink. Do let us." "Yes, do, dear uncle," pleaded Babs, "and then he'll make a very nice young Red." "All right," said Uncle Charlie, "only perhaps I'd better dip him." "Oh, yes," screamed the children. "How kind you are." "I like you very much," exclaimed Babs, dancing about in her excitement. So the little white wooden man was made a bright red, and Uncle Charlie delighted the children still further by inking him a nose, mouth and eyes. "Shall I give him a mustache?" he asked. "I don't think sons ever have mustaches," said Babs doubtfully, "only uncles and fathers." "He's quite the handsomest of all the toy people now," observed Teddy, looking admiringly at his uncle's handiwork. "He's the only one with a mouth," piped in Babs. "Oh, thank you so much, dear uncle." "Yes, thanks awfully," said Teddy. And then, as Uncle Charlie had nothing else to do, he played with the children for a little, and made them a paper boat out of a sheet of writing paper, and a tiny cocked hat. "You's awful clever," said his little niece admiringly. "I don't think there's another man in London what is so clever and so kind." Uncle Charlie was quite pleased with their devotion. "I'm glad we make the children so happy," he thought to himself. I must tell Ned about them when I write. It will please him and Barbara. The next time there was a catastrophe among the toy people, and Barry Brown's hat was licked white by the dog, of course the children knew where to go to have it set right. "Uncle Charlie will do it for us," said Teddy, confidently.
"Oh, yes," agreed Babs. "He will be sure to do it. I'm glad we've got an uncle what is so kind. It makes there always a help for things."
"We will go now and get it done," said Teddy, and he and his little sister tore downstairs, and hardly waited for an answer to their rap before they rushed into the library.
"We've brought Barry,"
began Babs, but then she saw that Uncle Charlie, who was leaning back in a chair, was scowling dreadfully. "Now then, you youngsters, clear out of here, and look sharp about it," he said angrily.
"What's the matter?"
gasped the little girl. "Do you hear what I say? How dare you stand there staring, when I have told you to go? Be off at once, and don't come bothering down here again." The children rushed upstairs in a panic. They could not know that some very persistent tradesman had insisted on immediate payment of their bills, and Uncle Charlie had ordered them out of the house in a fury, being ready to vent his superfluous anger on the first objects that turned up, which unfortunately were poor little Babs and Teddy.
"What was we naughty about?"
asked Babs, breathlessly. "I expect it was going downstairs without being sent for," Teddy thought.
"But we went the other day, and Uncle Charlie wasn't a bit angry."
"That does make it puzzling," answered Teddy, doubtfully.
"If it had been Aunt Elinor, I shouldn't have been prized," said Babs, sadly. "But Uncle Charlie what used to be so kind."
"He isn't kind now," observed Teddy.
"Don't you think he ever will be again?"
"He may. Grown-ups often change, you know."
"I hopes Uncle Charlie will, but I should be too frightened to go down again to see."
"And I should."
"Do you think mother and father in INJA will be at all like Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor?"
asked Babs, a little anxiously. "I expect so," said Teddy, gloomily.
"I don't think I likes fathers and mothers and uncles and aunts," whimpered Babs. "It was much nicer in the country with just Giles and all the lambs and chickens and things. I's tired of London."
Poor little people. It was so easy to make the sun shine in the nursery, and cross, selfish Uncle Charlie had hidden it all away with his ugly thundercloud, and then he went down to the club and forgot all about it. CHAPTER V. About lessons. The new governess had come, and lessons were quite a fresh experience for Teddy and Babs. Nana used to teach Teddy to read and write, and Babs had learned a little of both too, but on the whole they were very ignorant children for 7 and 5 years old. Miss Grimston was a real old-fashioned governess, very prim and proper and particular. Thoroughly imbued with that most absurd of dying theories, that children should be seen and not heard, just as if their fresh original chatter were not one of the most delightful things to be found in life, and the expression of their quaint baby thoughts one of the most entertaining. Moreover, she labored under the delusion that it is better to drag out and punish all the current naughtiness of the nursery, than just simply and quietly to look the other way; to extract continuous confessions of unreal sorrow for unrepented of deeds, instead of diverting the child's thoughts and feelings into another better channel, and letting well alone when you have done so. Miss Grimston was an excellent person; conscientious down to the heels of her little flat boots; and invaluable in carrying out any work which she undertook, provided it was not the education of children, for which she was utterly unfitted. It is strange that, though people are very particular not to select grooms who know nothing about horses, it does not seem to occur to them that an equally careful selection should be made concerning the trainers of their children, and nobody chosen for that work who does not truly understand the mysteries of child life. But it was hardly surprising that Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor should not have regard to this, for they themselves did not know that there was anything in children to understand. And when Miss Grimston arrived weighted with testimonials, they were only too glad to secure her services, and hand over Babs and Teddy at once into her keeping. But the children did not take to Miss Grimston. They disliked her stiff, severe manner, and shrank from her grey granite nature.
"She's not very nice," said Babs solemnly to Teddy, "and her hands is all loose bones what might rattle. I don't think I like her much."
"Nor I don't," agreed her brother. "She won't be able to play one bit. And I know she'll scold. I wish some wild beasts would eat her all up," he added fervently. Babs looked very serious, until the last happy suggestion.
"P'raps they will," she exclaimed cheerfully. "Anyhow, we can hope it."
The nursery had been turned into a schoolroom, and poor Nana sent with tears in her eyes to sit in the maid's room with Wace. "Good morning, children," gasped Mrs. Grimston, breathless from her mount up the long flight of stairs. "Good morning," they answered gravely from a distance. Children generally know by instinct whom it is safe to kiss. "Come near and shake hands nicely," continued the governess.
"I don't think I'd like to shake hands with you," said Babs. "Your fingers is so bony."
Miss Grimston looked severer than ever. "You are a very rude little girl," she said sternly. But perhaps she thought it better not to press the matter. Teddy was soon settled with a copy to write, and Miss Grimston brought out A Child's Guide to Knowledge with which to educate Babs. After reading over a few questions and answers several times, during which process Babs sat with a wondering look on her bright little face, Miss Grimston decided that the lesson had been sufficiently learned. "Stand with your hands behind you, Barbara," she said.
"Why?"
asked Babs, surprised. She had never done such a thing in her sensible out of door life before, and she did not see any reason in doing so now. Perhaps, on the whole, Babs was right. "Because I tell you to, that is enough for little girls." Babs looked puzzled for a minute, and then a sudden light illuminated her face.
"Are I going to do 'nastics?"
she said with a little laugh. Miss Grimston took no notice of her question, but turned to the open book. "My dear child, are there not many things that you would like to know?"
"Oh, yes,"
screamed the little girl delightedly.
"I would like to know what makes there come such lot of colors in the water bottles, and why the crumbs jump up when we slaps the table, and—"
"Be quiet, Barbara," said the governess angrily.
"But you asked me,"
exclaimed Babs, bewildered by the rebuke. "You were saying your lesson, remember. The answer is yes."
"Yes, please, I s'pose,"
interrupted the little girl. Miss Grimston returned to the book. "Pray, then, what is bread made of?"
"Dough and barm," replied Babs promptly. "I've often seen cook make bread at Cloverdale. Teddy and I used to each have a piece to make little men with bead eyes what grew fat in the baking."
"Silence!" cried the governess in despair. "That is not the right answer."
"Isn't bread made of dough and barm in London? It always is in the country, I know."
"The answer is flour. What were you thinking of, Barbara, when I read this lesson to you?" Babs looked doubtful for a minute.
"I was thinking about what makes you have so many more bones in your hand than other people's," she said candidly.
"Be quiet, Barbara. How dare you be so rude?"
"Am I rude? I didn't know. But you is so funny," continued the little girl. "You keep asking questions, and when I answers them you say, 'Be quiet.'"
"You are a very naughty, pert little girl, and I shall put you in the corner."
"What's that?"
asked Babs with interest. Hitherto she had been quite ignorant of nursery penalties. "Go and stand in that corner with your face to the wall." Babs cheerfully complied.
"What happens now?"
she asked a minute afterwards. "You will remain there until you are good."
"I's like a cow what's in a stall," laughed Babs. "Teddy, I's pretendin' I's dear Flossie. We've never played this game afore."
"Be silent, Barbara," cried Miss Grimston, in the last stage of irritation. "It is not a game at all. It is a disgrace." Babs then began to make a sort of gentle munching sound, and occasionally shook out the ends of her sash.
"That's Flossie's tail whisking," she murmured, quite content.
The exhausted governess now turned her attention to Teddy's copy book, and to her dismay perceived a number of black lines covering the whole page. "What is this?" she asked severely. "You told me to cover with ink the lines that were made, and then to copy them. I like covering the lines best, so I left the letters till last." Miss Grimston looked at Teddy. He had such a sweet, innocent face that he could not really have meant to be naughty. It did not occur to the governess that an angel face may be coupled with a boy's soul. And besides, she had already decided that Babs was the naughty one. The little girl had been so rude and obstinate, while Teddy seemed so gentle and polite. So, after a mild rebuke, she turned over a new leaf, and watched for a while his laborious attempts to copy the printed writing. And certainly Teddy was not so actively naughty in school time as Babs. He was so much less intense than his sister in all his feelings, that this was really the result of idleness rather than of excessive virtue. Poor Babs was always in trouble of some kind, and the sad part of it was that it all came without her meaning to be naughty at all.
"Things so often turn out nasty," she said wistfully to Teddy.
But this was how it happened. Miss Grimston had a strict theory that school time must be kept rigidly, and no irrelevant talking or laughter allowed therein; and Bab's nature and habit were always to talk and generally to laugh. She thought of so many things to say, and her words tumbled out before she remembered it was school time. And also such lots of funny things happened that she could not help laughing at them. Miss Grimston's pen might give a scratch, or better still the slate pencil a squeal, and the little girl would break out into the merriest laughter. She really could not help it, for it was so splendidly funny when a book fell down, or Miss Grimston knocked her knuckles against the piano, or Teddy dropped his pocket handkerchief. She had always laughed out of the fullness of her cheery little heart, and how could she be changed all in a week to suit Miss Grimston's 50-year-old fads? But of course Babs did not see all this. She only knew that she was always being scolded and punished for doing what was to her the most natural thing in the world, and really how could she help it? Bad reports of her conduct were continually being sent downstairs, and Aunt Elinor said it was just what she expected; but Uncle Charlie only laughed. Miss Grimston's battles with Babs amused him vastly. One of the most serious bones of contention between the little girl and her governess was the weekly letter to her father or mother in India. Babs had been accustomed to printing in wild, crooked letters a few disjointed, quaintly spelled sentences entirely out of her own head; and her mother was wont to laugh and cry over these dear, funny little letters, which generally ended in a lot of kisses and scribbling, all of which Babs felt sure her mother would understand as well as she did. But with Miss Grimston came a new order of things. She insisted on proper letters written in a large round hand, and saying such things as she thought fit, or sometimes penciled underneath. And Babs, who saw the impropriety of this style of correspondence, rebelled.
"If you say the things, it is your letter," she argued one Thursday morning while Teddy was peacefully plodding through Miss Grimston's copy on the slate. He was glad to be saved the trouble of making it all up for himself. "Do not be so troublesome, Barbara," said the governess grimly. "I aren't troublesome," answered Babs, "only I do want to send mother a letter of my very own."
"What do you wish to say?" severely.
"I can't tell you, really, Miss Grimston."
"And why not, pray?"
"It wouldn't be at all polite, 'cause, you see, I want to tell mother about you."
Miss Grimston's face became very sultry. "Your mother would not read such a naughty, rude letter," she remarked sternly, and with a remarkable disregard of truth.
"Yes, she would," contradicted Babs, flushing with temper, "and she would like it much burn your dirty old letters," defiantly. "I shall not allow you to write at all, unless you behave yourself, and come at once and ink over this pencil copy, which I have done for you." Miss Grimston stooped to lift Babs on to her high chair, but the child stiffened in every limb, which is a sure sign of infant depravity, and uttered a piercing, tearless yell. "You are an exceedingly naughty little girl," said the governess angrily, "and I shall not allow you now to write at all. I shall send a note instead to your mother to tell her how naughty you are." Babs began to cry violently and sat screaming on the floor while Miss Grimston fulfilled her threat; and Teddy, after the manner of children, took absolutely no notice whatever of the storm of tears. "Cease that noise at once, Barbara," said the governess as she looked over Teddy's dull little letter. But here again Babs had neither the power nor the inclination to obey. It would have been a physical impossibility for her to suddenly swallow down all her woe. Miss Grimston picked her up with a vicious little shake. "Do you hear me? Cease crying this moment," she repeated. And Babs' spirit rose within her. "Get away, you beast!" she cried passionately.
A chill horror fell upon the room. Miss Grimston's bony fingers relaxed their hold, and she solemnly rang the bell for nurse. " Put Miss Barbara to bed at once," she said, in an awful voice, when Nana appeared. " And she is to remain there in disgrace for the rest of the day. I shall inform Captain and Mrs. Conway of her outrageous conduct myself." Nana was only too glad to carry her darling away from the governess, and the dreaded dominion of lessons ; and she hushed and soothed the sobbing child, though she dared not disregard the command to put Babs to bed. " My letter," wailed Babs. " I only wanted to write to mother and tell her how horrid Miss Grimston is, and now she'll write and tell her I've 'rageous conduck, like Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor, and nobody won't understand." " You shall write yourself, lovey," said nurse soothingly, " and Nana'll put it in the post, and it'll be all right." The thought of the letter wonderfully cheered Babs, and the sorrows of the morning were quite forgotten in the excitement of writing it that afternoon. She sat up in bed in her little red dressing gown, with flushed cheeks and very bright eager eyes. " It shall be a very long one, and Nana, you must tell me when I can't spell the Finskite right." " That I will, Miss Babs, dear," said nurse lovingly. " Called her a beast, did she ? Bravo !" laughed Uncle Charlie, after Miss Grimston had gone home in a whirlwind of righteous wrath. " What a lark !" Aunt Elinor laughed too. " She is an old cat, I must say ; but really Babs is an awful child. I shall be thankful when Ned and Barbara come home." And then the remembrance that Teddy was in the room, playing by himself in the back drawing room, changed the conversation. " Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor aren't a bit angry with you about Miss Grimston," said Teddy cheerfully, as he had tea, a cosy tea prepared by Nana, on a little table beside Babs' bed. " They both laughed, and Uncle Charlie called you a lark, and Aunt Elinor said Miss Grimston was a cat. And Uncle seemed rather glad you'd called her a beast." " Did he really ? I thought it was dreadful naughty." " But Aunt Elinor said you were an awful child." " I know, that's 'cause I'm not pretty. Do you think mother will mind 'bout me not being pretty too?" " I don't know. Did you write mother a long letter?" " Oh yes, a splendid one, what told her all 'bout it." " Barbara," said Miss Grimston sternly on the following morning, " are you prepared to apologize for your unseemly insult of yesterday?" " What do you say ? Are I what ?" asked Babs, somewhat puzzled. " Are you sorry for speaking to me as you did yesterday?" " Oh yes," said Babs eagerly, for children never bear malice. " I are very sorry, and to day I are kite good." " I am glad to hear it," said the governess, sighing a little, " and I hope you will never be such a wicked child again." " Uncle Charlie didn't think it at all naughty to call you a beast," continued Babs pleasantly. " He seemed rather glad, Teddy said. P'raps he and Aunt Elinor don't think beast a rude name. I don't 'spect they can, 'cause Aunt Elinor said you were a cat, and in course she couldn't be rude. But a cat is a beast too, isn't it?" Miss Grimston's face became a dull chocolate colour. It was her way of blushing. But she did not know what to say. She only felt a feeling of intense irritation against the innocent child. " Look over your geography lesson while Teddy says his spelling," she almost hissed. Babs looked surprised. What had made Miss Grimston angry again was a complete wonder to her. She supposed it was one of the inexplicable mysteries of the grown up. Babs hated geography, but the lesson had one redeeming feature. In due course Miss Grimston asked what was the capital of Cornwall, and Babs answered with a little shriek of amusement, " Bodmin on the camel's back." Teddy had been the original perpetrator of this excellent joke, but its repetition brought unfailing delight to Babs. A severe rebuke always followed in its train, but the children resignedly bore that for the sake of the wit. Music lessons too were always a sorrow to Babs. Teddy was a musical boy, and caught things by ear, and in fact took as naturally to the piano as a young duck to water, but practising to Babs was labour and sorrow. Miss Grimston sat beside her and occasionally rapped the fat stupid little fingers with her spectacle case rather sharply. A note once played wrong was always played wrong in Babs' case. She toiled through the Blue Bells of Scotland with the greatest effort, and invariably alighted on C instead of E for the bonny note.
"I's so hot," she gasped after her sixth try for E. "Mightn't I rest a bit?"
"Certainly not. Play your scales now." The thumb wrench, or, as it might be called, the thumb screw, in the scales was even more exhausting, and Babs drew her breath hard in her anxiety to accomplish it.
"I writed to mother all yesterday afternoon,"
began the little girl presently, for she had no idea of secrecy. There never had been any reason for it in her happy life up till now.
"And I told her all about the beast."
"Then you are extremely defiant," said Miss Grimston angrily. "I specially forbade you the privilege of writing to your parents, and I am much displeased at your daring to do so." Babs bowed her head to the storm, but she did not quite understand what her governess was saying.
"Teddy,"
she said, when lessons were over, and Miss Grimston gone,
"I don't think I'll tell things again to people what don't understand. It makes it so nasty."
"I wouldn't," answered her brother. "It's safer not."
"What makes it safer?"
asked Babs.
"It never mattered at home."
"Giles and Nana were different."
"I'm glad I writed to mother. She'll be pleased to get such a very long letter."
But the arrival of that mail in India brought a good deal of anxiety to Major and Mrs. Conway. "Oh, my poor Babs!" cried her mother. "Do look at what she says, Ned." And then she showed him the funny little printed scrawl.
"Dear muvver, she's dreadful I called her a beast, and I wish you'd come home soon, your lovin' little Babs."
"And there's such a horrid letter from that odious governess. I know she's unkind to my poor baby. Oh, Ned, do take me home to them as soon as ever you can." And Barbara Conway covered her little daughter's letter with kisses, and when the Major took it up the page was all wet. "What does the boy's letter say?" "Oh, just a dull schoolroom copy, not from Teddy at all, but done by that woman. But I'm sure, Ned, that things are going wrong. And I do want to go home so dreadfully. It is very good of Charlie and Elinor, but they know nothing about children, and now they've got this horrid governess. Read her letter, and then burn the vile thing." So Major Conway read: "Dear Madam, I feel it my painful duty to inform you that your daughter Barbara is in so insubordinate a frame of mind that she is unfit to write to you her periodical letter to day, and also that her conduct is at times so outrageous that ordinary childish penalties prove utterly inadequate. Yours truly, Eliza Grimston." "Beast!" exclaimed his wife, thereby echoing her little daughter's sentiments of nearly a month ago. CHAPTER VI. RONALD'S VISIT. Teddy and Babs were in a state of great excitement, for Aunt Elinor had just been into the nursery to say that an uncle of theirs, whom they had never seen, was coming to spend a few days at Onslow Square, and would bring with him his little boy, who was just 6 years old.
"I'm so glad he's not 7," exclaimed Babs, "'cause being 6 makes him equally between us."
"6 is rather little," said Teddy loftily, from his superior standard of 7.
"Oh, no, Teddy, it's just a splendid age," persisted Babs eagerly. "What fun we shall have."
And the best of it all was this: Uncle Charlie said Miss Grimston should take a little holiday, so that Teddy and Babs could play with their cousin Ronald all the time. A long while before Ronald and his father could possibly arrive, Teddy and Babs stationed themselves at the nursery window, while Nana held on to them behind to prevent them in their eagerness from overbalancing themselves. It was quite a treat being allowed to look out of an open window at all, and Babs thoroughly appreciated it.
"Look, Teddy, isn't it fun seeing into the open carriages? That lady has a red book on the seat opposite, and that gentleman is crying."
"It's dust in his eye, I expect," suggested Teddy.
"And, oh, look, Nana, that old lady is speaking to the footman. Do you think she's asking him if the horses are tired, or which is the way home? Oh, I wish we could hear. And there's a nice hansom walking, and the driver has a newspaper open what he's reading at the top. I never knew drivers read while they was driving hansoms. But it makes a lovely table. I'd like to be a hansom driver, all 'cept the readin'. I don't like readin'. How funny things look from up here. I 'spects angels see like we do now from right up so high. I'm so 'cited 'bout Ronald. He's sure to be nice and play with me too, isn't he, Teddy?"
"Yes, indeed, Miss Babs, dear," interrupted nurse. "You must all three play together nicely. I won't have the boys leaving you alone."
"You won't want to, will you, Teddy?"
asked Babs, wistfully. "There's a cab with luggage. P'raps that's Ronald," suggested Teddy, who did not wish to make any rash promises. The excitement of the cab, even though it did not pull up at the door, quite diverted Babs, until she caught sight of her uncle, who had just come out of the house.
"Look!" she cried. "There's Uncle Charlie. He's speaking to William, and he's rather cross, I think. Now, William has run back into the house for something, and Uncle Charlie's tapping his stick in a hurry. Oh, it's cigarettes. I expect those were the ones that William meant to smoke himself, only Uncle Charlie will have them. Poor William! Oh, look! There's another cab. And it's stopping here. Oh!" she screamed. "It must be Ronald. Can we go down now, Nana, or must we wait till Aunt Elinor sends up?"
"She will send directly, lovey. Let me brush your hair, and wash your hands, and take off your pinafore already." When Teddy and Babs were ushered into the drawing room, they saw a tall gentleman and a little thin dark boy, dressed in a kilt, who had such a bright, laughing face that Babs smiled too, and said, "I likes you, Ronald. And what a funny little short thick frock you have got on."
"That's my kilt. I'm a Scotchman, you see." "What's inside the rabbit?"
asked Babs, stroking Ronald's sporran, while Teddy was talking to Aunt Elinor and his new Uncle Jack.
"Oh, daddy," cried Ronald, "she calls my sporran a rabbit. Isn't she funny?"
Babs never minded being laughed at. She was such a merry little soul that she always laughed too, and everything was pleasant. It was different with Teddy. He hated anyone to laugh at him. But herein the little boy and girl were not very unlike big ones. Nursery tea that night was delightful. Ronald was such a dear, jolly little fellow, and so full of excitement about coming to London.
"I have got to see everything in London in 1 week," he told Babs, between his mouthfuls of bread and jam, "and daddy has promised to take us all to the Zoo his own self."
"Us too?"
screamed Babs, in ecstasies at the thought.
"Yes, of course, and to see the river." "We've seen the river," said Teddy.
"Yes, there is such funny boats on it what puts their spouts down,"
added Babs. "Too, I want to hear all the bells we sing about that say things."
"What things?"
asked the little girl. "Oh, don't you know? Oranges and lemons, says the bells of St. Clement's."
"I owe you 5 farthings, says the bells of St. Martin's,"
chimed in Babs.
"I never thought somehow they was real bells."
"Of course they are," said Ronald. "What day is to day?" "Monday," answered Teddy.
"And we go home on Saturday. That makes it very awkward, 'cause I expect they only ring on Sundays."
"I never heard them," said Teddy.
"I don't think oranges and lemons would be kite Sunday things to say. It's a week day game, you see,"
observed Babs. "What a bother," said Ronald. "I'll ask daddy. He'll know all about it."
"Will he understand?"
asked Babs, a little anxiously. "Understand? Of course he will. He always understands things I ask him. All fathers do."
"Do they?"
exclaimed Babs, brightening up again.
"We didn't know."
"Our father and mother are in India," said Teddy. "I've only got a father," said Ronald. "You're better off than me."
"I think it's better to have only a father in London than a father and mother in India,"
was Babs' opinion. The next day Uncle Jack proposed a visit to the Zoo; and he and Uncle Charlie said they would take the children off by themselves, which plan delighted Aunt Elinor, who was full of other engagements of her own. William was told to whistle 2 hansoms, and the children capered about in wild excitement at the prospect even of the drive. "Who will come with me?" said Uncle Jack. "I will, daddy," shouted Ronald. "And I," echoed Teddy and Babs in one breath. "Won't anybody come with me?" said Uncle Charlie. Babs' face flushed. She wanted dreadfully to ride with Ronny, but yet her loyalty to Uncle Charlie interfered. Both uncles saw the struggle; but Uncle Jack lifted Ronald and Teddy into the first hansom, and then turned to do the same for Babs. Uncle Charlie stood alone behind.
"I think I'll go with you," said Babs, suddenly turning towards him. else you might be rather lonely."
"Yes, I might," said Uncle Charlie, stroking her hair more tenderly than he had ever done before. He was rather touched by the baby bit of self-sacrifice for his sake. So the cab started, and Uncle Charlie kept looking down at the child beside him with a new interest. How absurd to be pleased by such a little thing, he thought to himself. But a child's affection is not a little thing, only Captain Conway did not know this.
"I's glad I comed with you," said Babs presently.
"Why?" asked Uncle Charlie.
"'Cause you're my own uncle."
"So is Uncle Jack." Captain Conway had forgotten that Major Bruce was only related by marriage. Anyhow, Babs was quite ignorant of such a distinction.
"I think you are more owner,"
she decided after a little deliberation. "What makes you think that?"
"Well, you see, Uncle Jack's got Ronny for his own little boy, and you've got me," she added triumphantly. "So I must be more yours."
"She is really rather nice," thought Uncle Charlie, but aloud he said: "And who does Teddy belong to?"
"Aunt Elinor, in course."
"And don't you belong to Aunt Elinor, too?"
"Oh, no,"
said Babs, simply.
"Aunt Elinor only likes to have pretty little girls. But if Ronny is Uncle Jack's, and Teddy is Aunt Elinor's, I must be yours."
"And who belongs to your father and mother?" continued Uncle Charlie.
"Oh, father and mother in INJA haven't got no children." "Look, look!" she screamed. "We're passing Ronny's cab."
And the waving of hands and hats became so enthusiastic that it was a wonder none of the three children tumbled out. Uncle Charlie and Babs arrived first, and stood waiting for the others. In getting out of his cab, Uncle Jack nearly knocked his hat off, which was looked upon as an exquisite joke by the children. Ronald shouted with laughter, and the others took their cue from him.
"Uncle Jack's not a bit like you, is he, Uncle Charlie?" said Babs. "'Cause when things mess your hats you get very cross, but in course you have to 'cause your hats is all so delicate."
"Mine is pretty strong," said Uncle Jack, smiling.
"It looks older than Uncle Charlie's. P'raps that's what makes it stronger," suggested Babs. "The lions and tigers is all shut up tight, isn't they?"
asked the little girl somewhat anxiously, as they entered the Zoological Gardens. "Oh, yes, of course, and inside very thick iron bars," her uncles assured her. It was all very exciting, for none of the children had ever seen any wild animals before, and it was as if their best picture books had suddenly come to life. The elephant rather staggered Babs as she looked up and saw the line of his back against the sky. He seemed to her about the size of the Imperial Institute or Westminster Abbey. They loved the monkeys very dearly, and shrieked with laughter when those quaint, sad-faced little creatures performed their accustomed antics. Babs thought it would be delightful to have a little monkey of her own instead of her best doll.
"The camels is like a Sunday picture," she exclaimed as she saw them walking across the garden. But the thing that delighted the children most of all was a tiny wild mouse, which had crept into one of the cages to feed on the bits of grain. It was not part of the entertainment at all, but it appealed more to the child mind than any of the captured animals. They rushed to bring their uncles, who were enjoying their cigars outside, to see the wonderful mouse, and when at last it scuttled away, loud were their lamentations. "What a darling mouse it was!" cried Babs.
"I would have liked it awfully to take home and put in a cage," said Ronald. "And I should," chimed in Teddy. Babs held Uncle Charlie's hand very tightly in the lion house, but Teddy and Ronald rushed about and shrieked "Shoo!" in their shrill little voices right under the big lion's nose. But he was thinking about Africa, and looked beyond the children in doing so, just as we do when we are not thinking about the people who are speaking to us.
"The tigers are like 'normous great wicked tabby cats," Babs thought,
and though she did not like to own it, they frightened her rather. Teddy waxed very brave about tigers, having regard to the thick iron bars.
"They look savage," he told Ronald and Babs, "but you can frighten them if you look them in the face. If I met a tiger I should stand staring right into his eyes, and then he wouldn't touch me. I read about it in a book."
"I should run away as fast as I could, and shut my eyes tight," said truthful Babs.
"Oh, you silly!" exclaimed Teddy scornfully. "Then you'd get eaten. You should look him in the face like I should."
Just then Teddy turned down a pathway alone to explore, while Ronald ran back to ask his father something, and Babs went with him. A minute later the boy who would have faced a tiger rushed out for his very life with the terrier yelping at his heels. It required Uncle Jack's prompt assistance to drive away the dog, and soothe Teddy's sudden fright. "Why didn't you stand still and look him in the face?" asked his uncle, when calm was restored. Teddy's cheeks grew very pink, but Babs came to the rescue.
"Dogs is different, I 'spect," she said loyally. "And in course it's no use standing still to be bit." "Of course not," said Uncle Jack pleasantly. "Let's go and buy some buns. I dare say you are all hungry." The buns were a charming diversion, and Babs would insist on leaving a few crumbs from hers in different places, "in case that dear mouse came back."
Another day of Ronald's visit was filled with a still greater excitement. Uncle Jack's father and mother lived in a house past which a royal procession was going, and the Queen herself on her way to open some great public building. And the 3 children were invited to come and spend the day with Lady Bruce and see the show from there. Aunt Elinor went too, and to the children's sorrow laid down the law that 3 of them were really too many to be on the balcony crowding out other guests, so Babs was sent upstairs to see from an upper window, and Teddy was allowed to remain with Ronald on the drawing room balcony. Poor Babs felt just a little lonely when she found herself separated from the boys. And it would not be nearly so interesting to see the Queen now Ronald was not beside her; for Babs and Ronald had been talking a good deal about the Queen and the part she would take in the procession, and they had at length arrived at the conclusion that she would be seated on the top of a gilt carriage with a rose-colored dress and a helmet on her head.
"And a hay fork,"
added Babs.
"But that was Britannia, I think," said Ronald doubtfully. "Wasn't Britannia a queen?" asked Babs. "Oh, yes. She rules the waves, you know." "Well, queens is all alike," argued Babs triumphantly, and Ronald did not feel quite equal to gainsaying this statement. And now Teddy would have all the fun with Ronald, and Babs felt banished indeed. "I wish my hair was golden or something," she thought to herself sadly, "and then Aunt Elinor would like me to be downstairs. But she doesn't know when there's visitors." Fortunately Sir John Bruce's coachman's wife and 2 children, one of whom was quite a baby, were also in the room upstairs, and Babs found much consolation in kissing the baby and taking to the funny little Muse boy, who touched his forehead when he spoke and called her Miss, just like a real big live groom. "Father's carriage has gone to the show and taken the master along of it," he told Babs. "Is Uncle Jack's father the master?" she asked with interest. "Aye, that's it. Sir John and milady, we calls your uncle Mr. Jack." "Tommy, Tommy," said his mother, a sweet pale faced young woman who looked as if fresh air rarely blew through London Mews, "don't forget your manners, and mind you say Miss to the little lady." "Yes, Miss," said Tommy instantly, hitting his forehead with his forefinger. "My, we 'ad a busy day yesterday a getting the carriage all ready, Miss." Babs looked out of the window for a little, but she could not take it all in. A big pageant is beyond the child mind. One regiment of soldiers, or a village funeral, is as much of the processional as they can grasp at once. So Babs returned to Tommy and the baby. "My, there's some horses," was Tommy's comment every now and then. But Babs was quite happy sitting up on the bed and stroking the coachman's baby's funny little downy head, and inducing it to utter a gurgling laugh by playing Bo Peep with it under the counterpane. A row of housemaids filled up the window, and they had an excellent view of everything. But downstairs, Teddy and Ronald were enjoying the gay scene much more thoroughly. Ronald, who lived with his father's regiment, was a great authority on uniforms, and he was able to tell the admiring Teddy the military standing of almost all the members of the procession. Occasionally Teddy baffled his real knowledge, but Ronny was a sharp little fellow, and put down doubtful ones as Lord Lieutenants, which effectively silenced his cousin. As the time when the Queen was expected drew near, the little boys got ready to wave both hats and handkerchiefs. "It's lucky I had a clean pocket handkerchief this morning," said Ronald, "'cause it would never have done to have waved a dirty one at the Queen." "I didn't see the crown," exclaimed Teddy afterwards. "I was so busy shouting and waving that I didn't see anything," said Ronald, candidly. "But it was splendid, wasn't it?"
And then there came luncheon, and Uncle Jack fetched Babs downstairs, and the children had a dear little dinner all to themselves in a back room, over which there was no superintendence, and they could eat just what they liked.
"It was a splendid plan, us having dinner in a different room to you," said Babs on their way home in the carriage. "We did 'joy it so very much."
Her uncles both laughed. "I expect you will all be ill to morrow," observed Aunt Elinor. "Don't you like having dinner with us?" Uncle Charlie asked her. She was sitting on his knee because the carriage was so full. And somehow since that drive to the Zoo Uncle Charlie and Babs had begun to be friends.
"I'd like to have dinner with you, but I'll whisper the rest," she added cautiously, and put her mouth close to his ear.
What with the noise of the carriage and the roar of the streets, her uncle could not hear a word that she said, but Babs tickled his ear so much that he was obliged to rub it. This was a great joke to the little girl. She went off in peals of laughter, and of course wanted to whisper again, just for the fun of the thing, but Aunt Elinor interfered. "For goodness' sake, Charlie, don't encourage the child so. You make her so silly." And then the grown ups began to talk dull talk, and the children were left to themselves.
"What did you think of the Queen, Ronny?"
asked Babs that night.
"I did not see her," answered Ronald. "What did you?" "I didn't see her 'cause the maids was all in the window, and I was playing on the bed with the dearest little baby what was the coachman's." "I looked so hard that I saw nothing," Teddy owned. But for long afterwards the children talked of the great procession, and boasted of that day when they saw the Queen. Then, too, Ronald's visit made the everydays so nice. He invented such lovely games to play in Kensington Gardens, and they were always games in which Babs was wanted. "I like Babs to play," said Ronald to Teddy. "She makes things so jolly and laughetty." Ronald generally preferred to be either a soldier or a horse, and it was delightful galloping up Queen's Gate on a blazing hot July morning, and pretending they were the 3 horses of a gun carriage. On the Friday Uncle Jack went with them to the Gardens instead of Nana, and that made it much more of a treat. "Let's have our usual battle," said Ronald, when his father was safely settled on a chair in the shade. A large piece of paper out of Teddy's pocket was torn up into 6 portions, and screwed up tight by the children to make cannon balls. Ronald, of course, personated the Scotch army, Teddy the English, and Babs, for some occult reason, was the Chinese. They charged at each other from behind 3 trees, and for a moment the firing was brisk, till loss of ammunition caused Teddy to shout, "The battle must stop while everybody gets their own 2 cannon balls again." And then it was renewed with vigor, till Uncle Jack suggested that the children really must sit down and get cool. "I know what we'll do, Babs," said Ronald. "You take the one end of this long piece of grass in your mouth, and I'll take the other, and we'll num till we meet in the middle." This proved a most successful form of entertainment. "I can num faster than you, Ronny," said Babs triumphantly. "No, you can't," answered Ronald. "Let's have a race," suggested Teddy, "with each a piece of grass, and see who nums it up first." It took quite a long time selecting 3 pieces of grass, and then Major Bruce was called upon to cut the ends equal with his penknife, and to give the word for starting. They nibbled away like 3 young rabbits, and Babs finished first to her great delight. Ronald came in second, and Teddy immediately lost his interest in the game. "I don't like eating grass," he said. But it was being beaten that Teddy did not like. "Whoa, whoa, steady now," shouted Ronald, suddenly leaping into the air. "Look, Daddy, I'm a horse." "Yes, so I see." "2, I'm a piebald horse." "No, Ronny, you're not," said his father teasingly. "Daddy, I think I'm rather a piebald horse." "Well, whatever you are, you must not run any more. You will be so hot and tired. And you are all going to a party this afternoon, remember." "Oh, yes," screamed Babs. "Let me sit by you, Ronny." "Will it be a dancing party?" asked Teddy. "I do hate dancing parties." "I love them," exclaimed Babs enthusiastically. "But I've only been to one." "I like eating parties best," observed Ronald, "and games and things, just between the eating." His father laughed. "You young glutton," he said. "I'm ashamed of you." "I wish you was stopping past Sunday," said Babs presently to Ronald, "and then you could have gone with us to church." But I don't like church in London as well as at Cloverdale."
"Why not?" asked Uncle Jack.
"Oh, 'cause I don't know 'bout all the people. It's so 'citing at home when Mrs. Forrester has a new Sunday bonnet, or when one of the farmers' families goes into mourning, and 'specially when one of the school children is hit. And 'sides, I can't understand all what they sing in London. But at home I can guess pretty well 'bout the amens and things." "Do you have Bible lessons?" asked Ronald. "Rather," exclaimed Teddy. "Horrid ones," chimed in Babs, "from Miss Grimston. All 'bout Adam and Eve, you know."
"That ate the apple," continued Teddy, as if quoting a piece from "The House That Jack Built."
"And was turned out of the square," added Babs.
"You have soon become a little Londoner," said her uncle, smiling.
"I wish I wasn't," said the child, "'cause the country was my favourite. But I rather forget 'bout it now. It's such hundreds of weeks since we left Cloverdale."
"About 8, I s'pose," said Uncle Jack, but the children had rushed off suddenly in pursuit of a wandering pigeon. And 2 months is really a very long time to a little child. The party that afternoon was quite a big one, with a long table set out in the dining room for tea, and conjuring afterwards in the drawing room. But children's parties indoors are rather a mistake. The boys all hung round the door as if they would not quite let go the way of escape, and the girls stared at each other chiefly without speaking at all. When they went to see The Conjuring the shutters were closed, and the room so dark that several of the smaller children wept, and had to be taken out and comforted. It was all very wonderful, of course, but no more so to the children than many of the commonplace wonders with which every day is filled. They laughed when the conjurer pulled yards of ribbon out of his mouth, and shrieked with delight when he found a live rabbit inside a little boy's pocket. But it was the appearance of the rabbit which appealed to the youthful audience, not the little boy's face. That was only appreciated by 1 or 2 grown-ups. A live rabbit in a drawing room! No wonder the children were enchanted. And they would have been equally so if a wild mouse had run into the room, or a common cat jumped through the window.
"Oh, Daddy," screamed Ronald when they reached home, "the man got a real rabbit and showed it to us. It was in a boy's pocket, you know." "It had lovely lop ears," chimed in Babs, "and minded me so much of dear Spotty." "I expect the boy did not mean us to know about the rabbit at all," said Teddy, "for he seemed quite vexed looking when the man brought it out. I shall put one in my pocket when I get home." "And there was a lion at the party, Uncle Jack," continued Babs. "It sat just in front of me." "A what?" asked Major Bruce, surprised. "A lion,"
answered Babs calmly, as if lions were the most customary guests at children's parties.
"I saw in the darkness its mane coming over the chair I sat behind."
"It wasn't a lion," interrupted Teddy, scornfully. "It was a little girl with very thick yellow hair, all loose."
"Oh, I thought it was a lion," said Babs, simply. "And Ronny did. We wondered if it belonged to the man, or to Mrs. Webb what gave the party."
"I thought it had come perhaps with the boy that had brought the rabbit," chimed in Ronald.
"I did not like the boy what sat beside you, Ronny," said Babs, solemnly. "He had such a cross face. Too, he was a rude boy. He said it was a nasty tea, Daddy." "But it wasn't really, Uncle Jack," exclaimed the little girl, eagerly. "There was only 2 plates of bread and butter with 9 pieces on each, and all the rest was cakes."
"You wouldn't any of you say such a rude thing as that the tea was nasty, would you?" asked Major Bruce.
"Oh, no,"
said the children in chorus, and then Babs added,
"If it was, I might just say so to myself, or think it in my mind, but I would never speak it out loud."
"That is right," said her uncle, smiling. The following day was a very doleful one for Teddy and Babs. Uncle Jack and Ronald went away.
"Good bye, Ronny. I wish you wasn't going,"
said Babs, with a little sob in her voice, and her big eyes brimming with tears. Ronald had been watching his father very carefully in the hall, so as he said good bye to Babs on the doorstep, he slipped something into her hand.
"I tipped Babs my only 6pence, Daddy," he explained to his father, on the journey, "like you did William and Parker. And you know, I like Babs almost as much as if she was a boy."
"Yes, she is a dear little girl, Ronny."
"Aunt Elinor likes Teddy better'n Babs, Daddy."
"But I think Uncle Charlie likes Babs the best."
"Do you? Oh, I'm so glad. 'Cause that makes it quite fair, you see."
CHAPTER VII. At the Seaside. The season was over. Big station omnibuses piled up with luggage lumbered through the streets instead of smart carriages, and brown paper was beginning to veil many of the windows. The flowers on the balconies were reduced to a kind of blossoming fried parsley, and the sediment of servant life seemed all at once to have risen to the surface. Housemaids and caretakers stood about on the doorsteps of the fast emptying mansions; and all the livery coats seemed packed, for every footman appeared in his shirt sleeves above ground. Altogether there was a hot, spent feeling in the air that made people suddenly long for the country, and feel that it was an impossibility to stay another day in the place where they had contentedly lived for the last 4 or 6 months. Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor were leaving town too, with the rest of the world, and Teddy and Babs and Nana, together with several of the servants, were all going down to a small house on the East Coast. The children had never seen the sea, and of course were greatly excited at the thought of their seaside visit. Aunt Elinor had expressed the opinion that Cowes would have been a nicer place to have chosen than Overshore, but Uncle Charlie was firm in preferring the latter, chiefly because a householding friend there had offered to lend him a cottage. So Aunt Elinor was obliged to give a grumbling consent, though she sighed sadly at the prospect of passing a dull month in one of the loveliest villages in England. She cheered up a little afterwards on hearing that some people she knew had a large house near Overshore, and a continually changing house party. Uncle Charlie thought bathing and sailing and basking about in flannels would be a delightful change, after the frock coats and stiff collars of London. And it really was fully a week before he expressed himself sick of such rural pursuits. They all arrived at Overshore on a lovely summer's evening, when the sea lay like a mirror under the sky, hardly taking the trouble to break into waves at all on the smooth shining sand. Teddy and Babs were extremely disappointed at their first sight of the sea.
"Why doesn't it jump?"
asked Babs, with a look of injured surprise on her face.
"And it's so little," exclaimed Teddy, "only like a broadish band of water just half round the land." "And I don't see no shipwrecks either," continued Babs. "Our sea picture book always had shipwrecks or icebergs, or something."
But the next morning they changed their minds when they went down to play on the shore. The sea had freshened, and was breaking in crisp little waves at their feet. And then, too, best of all seaside delights to London children, they were quickly divested not only of gloves, but of shoes and stockings also, at which their enthusiastic appreciation knew no bounds. They rushed about on the clean soft sand, and ventured so far into the water that their clothes were all splashed. They filled their buckets with a lovely wet slop that appealed straight to Babs' tenderest feelings, and emptied them again in an aimless manner, and without doing anything but enjoy themselves in a wild mad way, as only country-born children can, after a term of penal servitude in London.
"Overshore's the splendidest, most sighting place in the world," exclaimed Babs as they were dragged in to have dinner at Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor's luncheon. "Better than Cloverdale?" asked Uncle Charlie. The little girl looked puzzled. "Not quite so splendid," she decided at length, "but I think more sighting. Don't you, Teddy?"
"Much," said Teddy, who was not ever consumed by the spirit of loyalty.
"The sea is lots jollier than the brook."
"I had a letter from India just now," said Aunt Elinor, "from your father, and he says we must tell you that you have a little baby sister whom they will bring home to you when they come." Babs was delighted, but Teddy did not show much interest in the news. What could a baby sister matter to him, a boy of 7 years old?
"I've thought of a lovely name for it," said Babs, after a few moments' silence. "I would like it called Mrs. Brown."
Uncle Charlie laughed, but Aunt Elinor said sharply, "That is not a name at all."
"It is," persisted Babs. "I know it is, 'cause nurse has a sister-in-law what's called it."
"That's nonsense," said Aunt Elinor. "It is not a proper name for a child, and it's very rude to contradict." Babs' face fell.
"I didn't contradick," she said peevishly, "only I do know it."
As trouble seemed imminent, Uncle Charlie came to the rescue. "Never mind, child," he said kindly. "There are other nicer names than that. You think of one." Babs began to think so hard that she refused a second helping of pudding. At length a brilliant thought struck her.
"I know," she cried excitedly. "I've fought again. And I'd like her to be called Strawberry Jam."
"Really, Babs, how silly you are!" exclaimed her aunt. "Now, for goodness' sake, don't cry," as the child's face flushed with suppressed feeling. "If you do, you shall go up stairs." Babs blinked back 2 big tears. She did not say anything owing to a large lump in her throat.
"Uncle Charlie," asked Teddy suddenly, "was King Alfred the Great in the 10th Hussars?"
His uncle and aunt were greatly amused.
"Ronny told me he was when he stayed with us, but when I said so to Miss Grimston, she slapped me for — what did she say she slapped me for, Babs? I forget." "For telling lies and being impertinent," said the little girl glibly. "No, Babs, it was you she slapped for being impertinent." "Oh, yes, I remember now, 'cause I said I 'spected she was born in Alfred the Great's reign, and so would be sure to know. I do think so, really, don't you, Uncle Charlie? But that's the way with Miss Grimston, she never understands things."
Uncle Charlie continued to laugh. "You gave her one in the wind there, you young rascal," he said, pulling her hair. "But I'm glad I'm not your governess." The children both laughed at the idea of Uncle Charlie's being a governess.
"I wish you were, only your hands isn't bony enough," said Babs, hanging on to the sleeve of his blazer. "What fun it would be if you growed thin." Just then a lady caller was announced, who, seeing the children, begged that they might stay and speak to her. Aunt Elinor was instantly conscious of Babs' rumpled smock and rough hair, for she had heard that Lady Harriet West was a very particular, fastidious old lady; so she called Teddy forward, who looked sweeter than ever in his fresh new flannels, with his fair hair curling picturesquely around his forehead. Teddy really was prettier when his hair was rough and his face a little flushed. "Is this your little nephew? How do you do, my dear?" said Lady Harriet, kissing the boy. "I'm quite well, thanks," answered Teddy, politely. "Are you the lady who is the mother of our Mr. West, who asked us to come and stay in this dear little house?"
The old lady looked pleased, and so did Aunt Elinor. "Yes, my dear, and I hope you will come up to the castle and play with my little grandchildren. And is that your sister?" Babs rushed forward, shaking her hair back from her eyes like a Shetland pony, and Aunt Elinor trembled.
"P'raps you was born in King Alfred the Great's reign, 'cause you seem really a good bit older even than Miss Grimston," she began eagerly.
Lady Harriet looked appalled.
"Have I gived you one in the wind?"
continued the little girl anxiously, with a note of real concern in her voice. "Have you given me what, my dear?" asked the old lady. "I do not quite understand you." Aunt Elinor hastily came to the rescue, and sent the children out to play; but she was really very vexed with Babs, and directly Lady Harriet had departed her anger exploded. "I wish you would whip that child, Charlie. She is too awful." "Oh, I couldn't. It is much too hot," said Captain Conway, still laughing; "but I thought I should have burst when Babs came out with it. It's a mercy the old girl was a little deaf, or she would have been more surprised still." "It's all very well for you to laugh at, Charlie, but you spoil Babs frightfully. She's an awfully naughty child, and she grows worse and worse. My heart is always in my mouth when she is in the room; and if you won't correct her, she will be a perfect little fiend by the time Ned and Barbara come home." "Oh, nonsense," said Uncle Charlie. "She is great fun, and a nice little thing besides. You are rather hard on Babs, Nora."
"Hard on Babs!" exclaimed Mrs. Conway angrily. "How absurd you are! I never saw such a spoiled child in my life. She ought to be whipped, or she'll soon be unbearable," she added, as she went out of the room in a temper. Charlie Conway generally did what his wife wished without troubling to think matters out for himself; but he had a sense of justice deep down underneath the thick crust of selfish artificiality which she had helped so much to harden, and this sense of justice had fluttered into movement when Babs first claimed him as her own uncle, more owner than Uncle Jack. The child did not mean to be naughty; he made up his mind,
as he picked up his straw hat and strolled leisurely down on to the beach to find the unpardonable culprit. She was playing very happily on the verge of some most interesting rock pools, which disclosed wonders before undreamed of in her inland philosophy. She did not see the approach of her uncle, so enticing was a youthful crab, and his voice calling to her was a first intimation of his arrival.
"Oh, here is Uncle Charlie!" she shouted in delight to Teddy. "Is you really going to stay?"
"Come here, Babs," said Uncle Charlie, throwing himself down on the sand in a most injudicial attitude. The little girl rushed up to him.
"I'm so glad you've come," she said, beaming all over.
"Your aunt says I ought to whip you," he began.
"But in course you won't, will you, Uncle Charlie?"
interrupted Babs incredulously. "For being so rude to Lady Harriet," he continued.
"Was I rude?"
asked Babs, surprised.
"Why was I?"
"You must know that it is not at all polite to talk about giving people one in the wind."
"But you did,"
answered Babs reproachfully.
"So I didn't think it could be rude."
Uncle Charlie looked into the open little face and the honest brown eyes, and, being a man, his sense of justice triumphed. "What is often not rude for a man to say is very rude for a little girl to," he said lamely.
"I didn't know," said Babs solemnly. "But you isn't angry with me, is you, Uncle Charlie?"
Her face looked so quaintly anxious that Captain Conway could not resist the temptation of exciting still further emotions. "Suppose I am angry, Babs, what then?" It was a terrible supposition. The little girl sat looking down with crimson cheeks and quivering lips, trying not to cry, and yet overwhelmed with grief at the consequences of her crime. Uncle Charlie watched her with a tender amusement. "What then?" he repeated. Babs, thus brought to bay, was obliged to speak.
"I's so sorry," she said brokenly. "I didn't mean to vex you."
And her eyes could not manage to keep in the tears any longer. Uncle Charlie kissed her hurriedly. "There, there," he said soothingly. "I'm not a bit vexed." Babs flung both arms round his neck in a most heating embrace.
"I do love you so very much," she whispered,
and Captain Conway felt he was really growing rather fond of this little niece of his. She was so funny and earnest and dear. "Shall we build a sand castle?" he asked, when released from Babs' strangling embrace. A shriek of delight from the child indicated that the April shower had quite passed away, though her cheeks were still wet when Teddy came running up from the sea to help them.
"I wish I could cry another tear for you to taste, Teddy,"
said Babs, who had just made the discovery that tears and sea water taste alike.
"I've licked up the two last, and they was kite salt."
"I'll taste some sea water instead," suggested Teddy. "And then think of it when I cry next time." Uncle Charlie began to build the most delightful castle, but just at the most interesting part he grew rather tired of it, and went back to the house. "That's the worst of grown-ups," said Teddy. "They get tired of things so quick."
"But it's a lovely castle,"
exclaimed Babs enthusiastically.
"And in course Uncle Charlie was too busy to stay longer. Being a soldier makes him very busy, you see."
The following morning it was decided that the children should bathe, and they were delighted at the thought beforehand. There was an interesting sense of mystery in being shut up with Nana in the funny little damp house that was called a bathing machine, though when the horse began to draw it Babs was frightened.
"The house is running away," she gasped.
But Nana held her fast, and even lifted her up to peep through the tiny window, which showed her that it was only the land that was running away after all. It was great fun, too, undressing in such an interesting place, but when the door opened seawards an awful terror filled Babs' soul.
"Oh, we're right in the middle of the sea," she screamed, clinging to Nana. "Don't put me in, don't. Please don't."
Aunt Elinor was bathing from the next machine, and came up to the door. "Don't be such a silly cry baby," she said crossly, and held out her hand to Teddy. Now Teddy was a brave boy, and 7 years old, but even he could not help catching his breath with a sobbing sort of gasp when he climbed down the steps of the machine. The sight of the shore round the corner inspired him with fresh courage, and he consented, though tremblingly, to go in with Aunt Elinor. But nothing would induce Babs to leave the safe shelter of the machine. She sat on the step, a miserable shrinking little object, and every now and then just touched the water with the tip of her toes. Only the day before she had rushed fearlessly in when paddling from the beach, and had gone so far into the water that even Teddy suggested she might be drowned, but it was the landless view from the bathing machine door which created the terror of bathing. Finally, persuasions and threats having equally failed, Nana redressed her, and she forgot her fears, and began to enjoy watching Teddy, who was jumping about with Aunt Elinor. "Master Teddy! Master Teddy!" called Nana from the door. "Have you got your watch with you?" Nana appeared a little flurried at not finding the precious Waterbury among Teddy's garments, and it did not seem to occur to her that his present costume afforded but scant accommodation for a watch. "No, I haven't," shouted Teddy. "It's in one of my shoes." After his bathing experience, Teddy lorded it over Babs more than ever. He continually referred to his courage as compared to her cowardice, and every day after the bathe the little girl firmly resolved that she really would go in to morrow. But when to morrow became to day, she could not help changing her mind. When the children had been at Overshore for nearly a fortnight, a great trouble befell them. They came in to tea as usual one evening, and were surprised to find Nana in tears. Babs was specially surprised because, as she confided to Teddy afterwards, she did not know that grown-up people ever cried properly. "Oh, my poor lambs!" sobbed Nana, nearly smothering them with kisses. "What will you do without me?" "Without you, Nana?" questioned Babs. "Where is you going?" "I must go out to India to your mother and the new baby sister. Her nurse has died, and she don't know where to turn, poor thing. I'm sure I tremble at the thought of that long voyage all over again, for I've been twice to India. Once for you, Miss Babs, dear, and Master Teddy first of all. And now your poor dear mother wants me again for the baby. And I would be glad to go sooner than let the child be brought up by them heathen blacks, if it wasn't for leaving you two darlings." It is a terrible sorrow in child life when a dear kind nurse has to leave. Teddy and Babs cried themselves to sleep for several nights, and half the sunshine and gladness of their seaside visit was spoiled by Nana's hurried departure. The advent of the new nurse, too, was a bitter experience to the two children who had never been separated from their devoted old one. And unfortunately she was a very severe, strict person, with whom Aunt Elinor was delighted. "It was no good my speaking to the child when you and that old Nana spoiled her so disgracefully," she said to Uncle Charlie, for she had been very much annoyed about the sand castle instead of the promised punishment. "And I do wish you wouldn't take Babs off for any more of those ridiculous excursions. You make her 10 times as naughty. And besides, it is silly to waste such a lot of time playing with a mere baby when there is plenty of golf and tennis up at the castle. I am surprised at your caring to do so." "So am I," said Uncle Charlie, "but it is a fact nevertheless." "Oh, I wish Nana had stayed till we went back to London," sighed Babs, "'cause we don't want to do such a lot of naughty things there. And it was so lovely getting our clothes all splashed afore." For the new nurse had been very cross indeed when Babs came in with her frock and petticoats all wet from paddling, and had cruelly forbidden a repetition of that most entrancing exercise, in addition to dry bread for tea, and a dull, doleful half hour in the corner previously. Just when Teddy was out catching shrimps, too, or at least trying to catch them in a very weak little green net which had been purchased at Overshore's one toy shop with Teddy's long saved pennies. Neither was Teddy exempt from nurse's discipline as he was from Aunt Elinor's. She offended him mortally by insisting on washing his face herself, and in that peculiar unyielding manner which strict nurses are wont to adopt. "She washes just as if my face was quite flat," said the little boy wrathfully, rubbing his nose. "I know," said Babs meaningly, "that horrid round and round way, like as if we was a plate. And the soap always gets in my eyes. But I think she hurts more with the towel after." But all the disagreeable nurses in the world could not quite destroy the delight of seaside life. At night, when the room was dark, a sense of desolation would come over the children in dear Nana's departure, but in the morning when the sun shone and the sea danced, things seemed quite different. Babs would remind Teddy that Nana would soon come back, bringing with her both father and mother, as well as the new baby sister, And how could anybody cry or fret while those lovely sands, smoothed fresh every night by the sea, were waiting for the children to dig on them; while no end of beautiful pieces of seaweed were washed up on purpose for their play, to say nothing of the excitement of an occasional starfish or crab which had been left behind by the ebbing tide. The shore, too, was such a splendid place for pretending, it was so like a desert island, where the Swiss Family Robinson could be enacted, or where they could have encounters with savages or wild beasts. Sometimes they played with other children, too. A very quaint, bunchy baby was stolidly digging a little hole one day, and Babs thought it would be a very useful addition to their pretending plays. "Shall I speak to it?" she asked Teddy. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Teddy wondered. "I'll ask it," said Babs. The fat baby paused in its work as the little girl approached, and endeavored to reinstate the sailor hat which was hanging down behind its back, apparently fastened by a mixture of elastic and hair. "Which are you? A boy or a girl?" asked Babs, coming straight to the point. "I'm a mon," said the fat baby solemnly, and its tone admitted of no further observation on that score. "Will you play with us?" suggested Babs meekly. "No piggy?" remarked the baby irrelevantly. "It called me a pig," said Babs to Teddy in amazement. But the baby's nurse explained. "He has been frightened by a pig, miss." "We haven't got a piggy," said Babs. "We are pretendin' we're cast on a desert island, where there's black people." "No piggy?" repeated the baby. "Oh, no. Only a few lions and tigers. A very few, and not at all savage," she added hurriedly, as the fat round face clouded over. "Only yuns and tigers, no piggy," said the baby, apparently satisfied. "Come on," shouted Teddy. "We must dig a place to sleep in to night." Babs seized the baby's hand, but instead of following her, he sat down rather heavily and quite unintentionally on the sand. "I sit down," he observed, with a very pink face, which was evident. "He's too little to play proper pretendin'," said Teddy scornfully. "Come on, Babs." "Oh, dear, dear, vat a pity," remarked the baby. So Teddy and Babs finished their game alone, while the baby continued his digging, occasionally looking round anxiously, and assuring himself by the repeated observation, "No piggy fightin' Baba." On the way up from the sands, nurse walked with the baby's nurse, and Teddy and Babs each held one of its fat little hands. Babs assumed a squealing tone of voice in addressing it, to indicate its supreme youth as compared with her own 5-year-old maturity, and Teddy talked in the peculiar style usually adopted towards a kitten. "Look, little Baba, at the pretty moo cows," piped Babs in a singularly shrill voice. "They gave the nice milk for Baba's tea," continued Teddy condescendingly. "No moo cows feed Baba," said the baby in solemn, deep tones. "Nana give Baba nice tea." Babs instantly began to argue, only happily just then the children's and the baby's ways diverged, and a quarrel was averted. For Teddy and Babs had been invited to have tea at the old farmhouse, and a lovely time they had, eating shrimps out of little china mugs, and drinking wonderfully frothy milk fresh from the very cows that the baby on the beach had scorned. Then there was rich red jam, and no nurse present to intimate that they had had enough after they had only just begun. "Did you enjoy yourselves?" asked Uncle Charlie, when they reached home. "Oh, it was splendid!" screamed the children. "And such a beautiful tea!" "Jam and shrimps," began Teddy. "And ordinary cow's milk," chimed in Babs. And the children could not imagine what made Uncle Charlie suddenly laugh. "It's the way with grown ups," said Teddy afterwards. "They often laugh at things that aren't a bit funny." "It was ordinary cow's milk," persisted Babs, "'cause I asked Mrs. Grimble specially when it frothed so much." "Uncle Charlie nearly always laughs when we speak," said Teddy. "Well, I loves him much better'n Aunt Elinor, what never does. I likes laughing," and Babs beamed all over, "even when I don't quite understand what is funny." "I don't like things I can't understand," said the little boy. Unfortunately, holidays will come to an end, and summer too, for the matter of that. So the sad day dawned on which the children had to leave Overshore with all its joys and sunshine for a long, dreary winter in the little London nursery.
"It is years since we came," observed Babs, when the sea was out of sight, "but we only seem to have been here about 2 days."
In reality, they had been at Overshore just 6 weeks. CHAPTER VIII. The Boogie Owl. This is how the Boogie Owl came into existence. The new nurse was very strict and disagreeable, and she told Babs most unpleasantly one morning, during her rather refractory ablutions, that the policeman would come and take her, together with all other naughty little girls, to prison. But Babs, being a very sensible little person, wished this suggestion authoritatively confirmed before she really believed it. She had known the village policeman at Cloverdale as an intimate friend during the whole of her life, and consequently was not alarmed at just a blue coat and bright buttons. So, thinking it well to be on the safe side, she resolved that she would ask a policeman for herself on the first possible opportunity. When nurse and the children were out walking one day, Babs coolly accosted the first policeman she saw, and asked simply:
"Do you really fetch to prison all the little girls what splash over the sides of their bath?"
The policeman was a good-hearted man, and moreover he had a little girl of his own at home with brown eyes very like Babs, so he smiled kindly and answered: "No, little missy, that's only a silly tale to frighten you. The police are always ready to take care of little children and see as nobody hurts 'em. We only take bad grown-up people to prison." Before Babs could reply, nurse dragged her away in great anger, but the little girl kissed her hand to the policeman and shouted, "Good bye, nice policeman," in defiance of local authority. She spent a dreary afternoon shut up in the night nursery in consequence, but the policeman threat was finally exploded.
"I think nurse will go to prison for her next place," suggested Babs to Teddy, "for she is grown up and bad." "Very bad," said Teddy, looking at his fingers, which had been recently slapped. So it came about that nurse made up for the loss of the policeman by telling the children that the Boogie Owl would get them if they did not behave themselves. And this intangible horror was beyond their power to dispel. Indeed, it took such a hold of them, and they thought and talked so much of the mysterious creature, that their lives after sunset became a burden, and every dark corner a possible habitation for the Boogie Owl. And yet, there was a great fascination in talking about it in the daylight. Only the worst of it was their talks would come back to them after the gas was put out, and increase their original fear tenfold. "Let's talk about the Boogie Owl," said Teddy, one cold foggy afternoon in November. Babs gave a little shiver, but she really enjoyed the talks in a grim way at the time. "What do you think it's like?"
she asked Teddy for about the 100th time.
"Just like the picture of Pollyon in Pilgrim's Progress that Granny showed us on Sundays at Cloverdale, only with an owl's face and glaring eyes."
"How awful!"
whispered Babs. "I thought it was behind nurse's bed last night."
"It might be," assented Teddy gloomily, "for it must be somewhere in the house, you see, or else how could it get us so quickly as nurse says?"
"What does it eat, do you think, Teddy?"
"Children, I expect. It has long bony fingers."
"Like Miss Grimston's?"
"And it would claw you and tear you all up in pieces."
"Oh!" gasped Babs. "I think it is often in the bathroom at nights. I always shut my eyes tight and rush past the door. I wish the bathroom door was never a bit open."
"Sometimes it's in the chimney in my room," continued Teddy. "I hear it roaring. But I cover my head tight with the bedclothes."
"And I do, but it makes it very hot. I hate going to bed now. And nurse won't leave the gas turned on, even never such a little bit."
"I wish we were back at Cloverdale."
"And I do, where there were no horrid Boogie Owls, nor dreadful frightening creatures what come out at night."
"The Boogie Owl never came out at all till Nana went away."
"Don't you think it might die sometime, or be caught in a trap and killed dead?"
"No, I don't," answered Teddy, discouragingly. "I expect it'll live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old." But yet, though the children were so horribly frightened of this imaginary horror, they talked about it more and more each day, and consequently it became more terribly real. But after the manner of children, they never mentioned it to any one grown up, and even nurse herself had no idea of what a hold it had taken of their minds. One night, contrary to their usual rule, they continued their conversation concerning the boogie owl after tea, and when bedtime came, Babs felt she really dared not be left alone in the dark night nursery. She cried while being undressed, and was sharply reprimanded by nurse in the process. Teddy was so much less excitable by nature than Babs, that he was able generally to put on one side the haunting fears of darkness, and fall quickly asleep under the sheltering protection of the bedclothes. Babs had a little cold that evening, and was rather fretful and feverish, but nurse had no consideration for such foibles. She mentioned something about a dose of senna, which dried Babs' tears instantly, and induced her to go quietly to bed, rather than to have to swallow such a nauseous mixture. But when the gas was put out, Babs could not help thinking of the boogie owl. She was afraid to open her eyes lest she might see the dreadful apparition, and she lay panting under the bedclothes in a perfect frenzy of terror. The more she thought about it, the more certain she was that it was in her room; and at last, reckless of all consequences, she shouted aloud for nurse, even though her coming would involve certain scolding and probable punishment. But nurse had gone downstairs to share in the aftermath of a dinner party, which Captain and Mrs. Conway were giving that night. She had no patience with children who did not go to sleep properly. In fact, the children she was nurse to were always made to do so; and Babs called in vain. The darkness, the aloneness, and the imagined presence of the boogie owl were too much for the little girl in her frightened and excited condition. With a shriek of terror she flew out of bed, on to the landing, and down the stairs, with a cruel conviction that the boogie owl was pursuing her, straight into the brightly lighted drawing room where the dinner party guests were all assembled. Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor were immensely surprised. "Good gracious, what's the matter?" asked the former, catching Babs in his arms. But children rarely tell what is the matter, so Babs only burst into a torrent of tears, and clung to him with all her baby might. Aunt Elinor quickly rang the bell, and awful indeed was nurse's countenance when summoned to remove Babs. Surely this was trouble indeed. To be borne back to bed in deepest disgrace, and with such sundry shakes as expressed nurse's displeasure, to say nothing of the threatened penalties for the morrow, which, however, frightened Babs far less than immediate desertion. And nurse knew better than to leave her again. She saw that the child was desperate, and so she did her duty, though she inwardly vowed vengeance all the time. Aunt Elinor, too, was very vexed. "It looks as if we ill used the child," she complained to her husband, "and on the night of a party, too. I saw that horrid young Atherstone looking at me as if he thought I ought to be prosecuted by that cruelty to children thing." "Did you find out what was the matter after all?" "There was nothing really the matter, only the child was bilious, nurse says. She gave her a good dose this morning, and has kept her in bed." "As a prevention or a cure?" asked Uncle Charlie dryly. "A little of both, I expect," said Aunt Elinor candidly. "I don't believe it was biliousness at all," continued Captain Conway. "That is a piece of nursery conventionality. There must have been something the matter to bring the child downstairs in such a fright." "What nonsense, Charlie! You know nothing at all about children's ways, and it is no use your interfering in the nursery. The new nurse is a most competent person." Aunt Elinor was growing rather jealous of her husband's interest in Babs. "I doubt that statement somewhat," persisted Uncle Charlie, "and I should like to know what frightened the poor little thing so much." "You are getting perfectly infatuated about that child," said Aunt Elinor angrily. "And such an ordinary ugly little creature, too. I can't understand you, Charlie." Captain Conway glanced curiously at his wife, at the beautiful, graceful woman who looked so lovable, and he felt a sudden sickening want in her, a jarring of his sensibilities at her harsh words and vulgar thoughts. "We are in the place of Babs' father and mother," he said slowly. "I don't think mothers talk like that. Mine never did." And then he went out of the room, and straight upstairs into the night nursery. Poor Babs had rebelled against the hideous spoonful of black, sticky medicine with which nurse greeted her on waking, and also begged to be allowed to get up as usual. But nurse was adamant. "Little girls who don't go properly to sleep, but rampage about the house, must be very far from well, and treated accordin'," she said severely. "I are kite well to day," pleaded Babs. "It is my opinion you'd be all the better for a good whipping," observed nurse grimly, and Babs thought it prudent to drop the conversation. Teddy, too, was not very sympathetic. He thought it silly to be quite so frightened of the bogey owl, and could not imagine how Babs could rush down in the middle of a party with her nightgown on. Besides, what was the good? "You should have seen whereabouts the bogey owl really was," he said, in the bravery that is born of daylight, "and then we might have set a trap." "I was 'fraid to look," Babs confessed. "Are you sure it was in the room?" "Kite sure, certain. But oh! Don't let's keep on talking 'bout it, 'cause night'll come soon, and then I shall think it all over again." So when Uncle Charlie came in, Babs was a very sad little person indeed. She cheered up as he sat down beside her, and they really had a most comforting talk. "Tell me, Babs," asked her uncle presently, "what frightened you so much last night?" Babs shook her head. "Whisper it," coaxed Uncle Charlie. But for long Babs would not be persuaded. "I shan't be angry, little one." There was a new sound now in Uncle Charlie's voice when he spoke to Babs, and at last it won the child's confidence. She would only whisper it with her mouth so close to his ear as to produce nothing but a buzzing sound, but he succeeded in catching the word owl. "There is no owl here," he said at a venture. Babs nodded her head. "There really isn't," he assured her. "Owls never come into houses." "Not any kind of owl?" asked Babs, hope mingling with anxiety. "No kind at all, and they would not come inside any house even if there were, except very old tumble down ruins. And where there are any owls they only fly out at night. Because they are so frightened themselves." Uncle Charlie's comfort lacked tact in his zeal for truth. "What a pity!" exclaimed Babs. "'Cause it's in the night that I'm so frightened, and that doesn't help a bit." Captain Conway hastened to mend his mistake, and talk long and cheerily to his little niece. So fear of the bogey owl was almost dispelled. It settled down into only an unpleasant back thought instead of an ever present terror; because, as Teddy said, it wasn't nearly so frightening flying about out of doors as it was when it lived in the bathroom or behind nurse's bed. There were other fears besides that lay heavy on the children's souls, but those perhaps no one could have helped. Babs was always afraid lest wild beasts should be lurking on the back stairs, and rush out at her through the men servants' door in the hall, or the housemaid's one on the second landing, and Teddy was afraid of some of the things he heard Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor talking about when he was downstairs; especially of consols, which conveyed an inexplicable horror to the child mind. He used to talk to Babs about these mysteries, and enlarge upon them until his little sister shook in her ankle strap shoes, but there was a gruesome pleasure in doing so, which the children both enjoyed. "Old Mr. Fenton came to call to day," announced Teddy, after one of his drawing room visits from which Babs was generally excluded, "and he was telling Uncle Charlie again about the Consols." The children had come to the conclusion that the Consols were a wicked family of old Romans who lived in the city, and this opinion was founded partly on their own imagination, and partly on Miss Grimston's description of Consols in the Roman history lesson. "How was they to day?" asked Babs. "As bad as ever?" "Worse," said Teddy, "and they are going downer and downer." "Like Giles used to say the gamekeeper's son was going. You remember, Teddy? He always finished up 'bout him with straight down to ruin. But all the Consols seem bad, while it was only the gamekeeper's son that was." "Let's talk about what we pretend they do," said Babs. "They poach, of course," began Teddy, who was a squire's son. "And they cut good people up in slices," continued Babs, her eyes dilating with horror. "And eat children." "Oh, yes, like the ogres in the fairy book." "And fire guns close to your ears." "On purpose," put in Babs. "Of course on purpose. Let's pretend they are coming here to dinner." But the talk was getting a little too realistic for Babs' peace of mind. "No, don't let's pretend they are coming here, Teddy. It makes me so frightened. Let's pretend they are going to Miss Grimston's house. Oh, yes. Big old Mr. Consol has glaring eyes and black whiskers and great teeth, and one day he went out to find a good person to eat," began Teddy, whose imagination was fertile in the creation of horrors. "Miss Grimston wouldn't be good enough," interrupted Babs eagerly.
but it would be rather fun if he eated her, Teddy. Let's make him want only to eat bad people to-day."
"Oh, no," argued Teddy, "else he wouldn't be at all frightening. It wouldn't be wicked to eat only bad people, you see."
"Well, who can he eat?"
"I know, Uncle Jack and Ronny." Here Babs burst into such a scream of anguish that nurse interfered. "Now, Master Teddy, what have you been frightening Miss Babs about again? I won't have such nonsense, and if there's any more of it, I'll buy a birch rod, and you shall feel what that is like," she continued wrathfully. Teddy became very sulky. "I won't talk to you no more," he murmured in an offended tone to Babs. "You are such a cry baby, and then everything is spoiled. You never used to be so stupid."
"I wasn't so frightened afore," said the little girl humbly.
"Cry baby," muttered Teddy. "I won't play with you ever again." So Babs was left alone, sitting sorrowfully on a little bench by the fireplace, while Teddy fetched out his soldiers and pretended a most important battle on the ottoman. Her little mind and heart seemed all upside down, and yet she could not discern what was really the matter; only that things were dark and sad and miserable, and every day grew worse instead of better. The big tears rolled down her cheeks, and she caught her breath in the attempted suppression of heavy sobs. "Now, Miss Babs," said nurse sharply, "give over crying this moment, or I shall shut you up in the night nursery." This only made matters worse, so Babs was promptly removed into the penal settlement, and left there until she had learned how to behave herself. She climbed up onto a chair and looked sadly out of the window over the top of the mews. She was not nearly as happy and merry now as she used to be. Constant snubbings were beginning to dim the brightness of her child nature, and the still stronger element of fear which had crept into her life cast a black shadow across many of the once cheerful every days. Happily, before the little girl had been alone for very much longer, a sandy cat appeared upon the stable roof. A beautiful, entertaining animal which appealed at once to Babs, and filled her barren little soul with a new and immediate interest. She tapped the window, and the cat looked up. Clearly it was a most sociable creature. Afterwards, when she was fetched out to tea, Babs exclaimed quite cheerily, "There's a lovely cat on the roof under the night nursery window." "What sort of a cat?" asked Teddy, still a little coldly; for Teddy never could get over things all in a minute like Babs did.
"A yellow cat, what minded me very much of that splendid mouser in the stable at home. I like yellow cats, they don't bite as much as other colors."
"Why not?" shortly. Teddy could not make long pleasant remarks yet.
"They haven't so many tongues," continued Babs.
"They've just the same," remarked Teddy. "No cats have more than one tongue."
"Yes, they have,"
said Babs, querulously. "No more talking," interrupted nurse. "If you will quarrel, you shall eat your meals in silence. Another word, and you'll go straight into the corner," she added warningly, as Babs looked inclined to speak. Teddy began to eat his bread and jam very hurriedly, for he was afraid of being suddenly bereft of it as a punishment, but Babs was never thus worldly wise. Her slice seemed to give her a choky feeling, so she drank her milk up first instead. "What are you most frightened of in the world?" Teddy asked Babs a few days after, when things had really been very unpleasant in the nursery.
"The boogie owl, in course," answered the little girl promptly, "and a good deal of the consols."
"Are you at all frightened of nurse?" suggested Teddy. "She's so dreadful cross."
"Oh, no!" exclaimed Babs, amazed. "How could I be? She only scolds and puts on a corner or night nursery, and sometimes slaps. I couldn't be frightened of things like her and Miss Grimston. Are you?"
"I'm rather afraid of being whipped if it hurts," said Teddy, slowly.
"But that's just real and over," answered Babs, philosophically. "But the bogey owl is so dreadful when you think about it, and it seems hanging round outside ready to pounce, you know."
"I'm most frightened of real things," decided Teddy, who was smarting from a recent encounter with nurse's new rod.
"Oh, I aren't. The things we pretend are much more frightening, I think. I don't mind Miss Grimston's slaps a bit, 'cept just that minute. They're more disagreeable than frightenin'."
"I mind that beastly birch rod that nurse has bought, and I hate her," growled Teddy.
"Then I will hate her, too," agreed Babs, pleasantly, "'cause she's been so nasty to you to day."
It never seemed to occur to Babs that she should hate nurse for the long hours of punishment which she herself had been obliged to endure since dear Nana departed for that bourne which the children always spoke of as "father and mother in India." CHAPTER IX. Babs in Trouble. It all came of so much pretending. But then it was simply impossible for the children not to pretend. It would have been so dull to have lived their child lives only as the little Conways, when they might be pretending that there were such exciting things as soldiers or savages, cab horses or mice. And this particular pretense which caused all the trouble was one of Babs. Teddy was always pretending that he was a policeman, and consequently Babs wanted to be one too. But Teddy was firm on this point. He was the policeman, and Babs must think of something original for herself.
"There might be more'n one policeman in London," she whimpered.
"No, there mightn't," said Teddy sharply. So Babs had to content herself with being in imagination a postman, which seemed the next best thing. And of course a postman involved letters. There were the Indian letters, which Babs zealously saved, but they did not make nearly enough. Babs begged her uncle and aunt to give her any old letters to play with, and then she induced Martha, the second housemaid, to buy her a pot of gum, with which she and Teddy spent some delightful afternoons pasting up the old envelopes to look almost as good as new. And as they were finished one by one, they were safely hidden away out of sight of nurse's sharp eyes, down in the most secret depths of the old toy box.
"The postman drops a letter in at every house," said the little girl. "But then, you see, Teddy, nurse would find it out and spoil it all. I think I had better take the letters out, but only pretend to drop them into the houses."
So every day she started out on her walk with a packet of letters clasped fast in her fat little hand, and once or twice, when nurse was well on in front, Babs ran up the steps of the house and rang the servant's bell, but she only pretended to drop a letter in. She could not bring herself to part with any of the beloved treasures yet. But after a while this part of the proceedings became a little stale.
"I are a real postman," she explained to Teddy, "and in course I must leave real letters at the houses."
"It's no good leaving these old letters if you are a real postman," said Teddy, "because, you see, they all belong to this one house." This was a most distressing conclusion.
"S'pose,"
she asked her uncle at lunch that day,
"s'pose a postman dropped the letters at the wrong houses. What would happen?"
"He would be packed off about his business pretty quickly," said Captain Conway, "for he would not be fit to be a postman."
"You are quite right, Teddy," said Babs afterwards in the nursery. "You see, if I drop these letters at other houses, I'll be packed off 'bout my business pretty quick, 'cause I would not be fit to be a postman."
"Don't bother so," exclaimed Teddy, who was rather cross. And besides, he was a policeman and had no time for thinking about letters. So Babs was left to herself, and the responsibility of her unfulfilled duties lay heavily upon her baby soul. At last a brilliant thought struck her. She caught sight of the post box in the hall nearly full of nice, clean, new letters, which Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor had just written.
"I might post one of those," she thought gleefully. "There's such a lot that I could take just one out, like we used to do the birds' eggs, so that it shouldn't matter. Now I are fit to be a postman," she murmured with a glad little laugh, as she ran upstairs with one of the new letters in her hand. Teddy was out driving with Aunt Elinor, so it had to be hidden away without his seeing it. On the following day all went well. Babs was able to lag behind nurse and Teddy out walking, and to drop the new letter, which she had carried in the packet of old ones, right into the letter box of a strange house. And again that evening she succeeded in taking another letter out of the post box in the hall. This exciting program was kept up for several days, for every night on her way upstairs she peeped into the box, and if there were plenty of letters she took out one, but if there were only 2 or 3 she conscientiously refrained. "Child's only let us take 1 egg, if there was 3 left," she argued to herself, and had no further misgivings on the subject. But at last a dreadful thing happened. It was only a cold in her head when Babs awoke one morning, but the consequences were terrible. Nurse would not let her go out in the first place, and there was the letter which she had taken out of the box on the preceding night still unposted. She knew that it would be naughty to keep the letter. Posting, to Bab's mind, was just dropping it into any house that she could manage, but she felt the importance of this posting most thoroughly.
Downstairs there was a good deal of wonder and annoyance about invitations unanswered or delayed, and one or two more important letters unacknowledged, but Babs heard nothing of all this.
"Does it matter very dreadful," she asked Teddy, "if letters is sometimes a day late?"
"Oh, no," said her brother carelessly. "I heard Aunt Elinor say that they are often stopped for a little in the post. But don't begin bothering again about letters. Why can't you be a soldier or a cab driver instead?"
"I are a postman," said Babs gloomily.
And it was clear that Teddy could not be approached on the subject again. The next day Bab's cold was worse, and after lessons nurse and Teddy went out again without her. This was really serious. There was that letter still unposted, and Bab's conscience gave her no peace.
"S'pose a postman kept a letter in his own house for a long time,"
she propounded to Miss Grimston in the middle of a spelling lesson.
"What would happen?"
"He would be sent to prison as a thief," answered the governess. "But now, no more talking, Barbara. Go on with your lesson." The horror of this information lay like lead on the child's spirits.
"It's awful wicked to keep that letter," she decided,
as she sat alone in the nursery when the others were out.
"If I do, I'll be sent to prison as a thief."
And then an heroic resolve came into Bab's mind. She must do her duty as a postman even at the awful risk of nurse's displeasure. She would go out and drop it into a house that very minute, in spite of her cold. How lucky it was that the clean clothes had just returned from the wash requiring Martha's presence downstairs. For Martha had been left in charge of Babs during nurse's absence. Seizing her hat, for she could not put on either her own boots or coat, she flew downstairs with the precious letter and out of the front door unmolested. She stopped her flight on the causeway.
"Postmen don't never run," she murmured,
and was walking briskly round the corner when she came right up against Aunt Elinor. "Good gracious, what is the meaning of this?" cried her aunt, dragging her indoors, and just then nurse arrived home again with Teddy. A great storm of scolding seemed to surge round Bab's head.
"It's my letter. I was 'bliged to take it," she gasped.
Nurse gave her an angry little shake, and Aunt Elinor snatched the letter out of the child's hand. She could hardly believe her senses. There was the letter her husband had written 2 days ago enclosing a check, the receipt of which they had been anxiously awaiting. "Perhaps Charlie will believe me now about Babs," was her first thought, and an ugly feeling of triumph rose within her as she rushed into the smoke room to tell the husband the story of Bab's black crime. And Uncle Charlie lost his temper. He had been terribly worried about the apparent disappearance of his check, and to be suddenly told that the child had taken it out of its private letter box, and having kept it for a couple of days, had been caught by chance as she was stealing out with it on a mysterious mission of her own, was enough to make him very angry indeed. "I never heard of such a thing!" he exclaimed. "How dare she tamper with my letters?" Aunt Elinor fetched Babs in haste. "Where did you get this from?" her uncle asked sternly.
"I took it out of the letter box. I have tooked one every day," answered Babs, bewildered.
And then she said something about a postman, but nobody understood. Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor talked in such loud voices, and there seemed such a noise and confusion to the child, that explanation was simply hopeless.
"This accounts for all the delays and bother we have had just lately," said Elinor. "And then creeping out of doors with this letter, when she knew she had to stay in with her cold. I never heard of a child's being so sly and wicked."
"I am as much surprised as I am displeased." And Uncle Charlie spoke in an awful voice. He was really very much annoyed; and to deliberately take letters out of a letter box and keep them was a serious offence indeed, to say nothing of the remarkable expedition out of doors, and all alone, by which Bab's sin had been discovered. "How dare you touch my letters?" he repeated. "But I will put a stop to this kind of thing once and for all." And then Uncle Charlie gave Babs 2 or 3 taps on each of her fat little hands. Surely this was serious trouble, and poor Babs cried bitterly. It was all so dreadful and frightening, and Uncle Charlie angry was so much more awful than anybody else in the world. "Oh, Teddy!" she wailed when her brother peeped into the night nursery whither she had been borne in dire disgrace. "I meant to be such a good postman, and take the letters kite right. Why did it all turn out so dreadful naughty?
I don't understand."
"Did Uncle Charlie whip you hard?" asked Teddy, who was hungry with curiosity concerning the scene in the smoke room. The remembrance filled Babs with such woe that Teddy could get nothing out of her, and then nurse came in and banished Teddy instantly from the degrading atmosphere of Babs' presence. "Naughty, wicked little girls who steal are not fit to speak to other children," she said sharply, as she shut the door. But going out of doors on a winter's afternoon with a bad cold and no coat on, brought about more mischief still. Babs coughed all night, and awoke with feverish hands and a pain in her chest. The doctor was sent for, and kept her in bed all day with hot poultices on, and lots of nasty medicine to drink. Babs thought in her hot little head that it was all somehow part of Uncle Charlie's anger, but she was tired after the naughtiness and kept falling into restless sleep. And downstairs Uncle Charlie was wretched about her. His anger had quickly evaporated, and he felt as guilty about those harmless slaps as if her severe cold were all owing to them. Aunt Elinor's continual talk of Babs' offence irritated him dreadfully too. She was so glad to have proved to her husband that his little niece's naughtiness was of a nature that no one really could overlook; and he had begun to feel sure that there must have been a big mistake somewhere; for the more he thought of it afterwards, the more certain he was that such a baby could not have been such a criminal.
"I didn't understand. I really didn't," cried Babs, as he went up to see her in bed.
"Perhaps it is Uncle Charlie that didn't understand," he said tenderly, stooping down to kiss her. Babs instantly recognized the change in his tone, though she had no idea of what he was talking.
"Have you forgived me?"
she asked with a glad ring in her hoarse little voice. "Of course I have. And why isn't Teddy here to play with you? Nurse," he called, as he heard her outside, "why is not Master Teddy amusing Miss Babs? I found her quite alone when I came up." "I thought you were displeased with Miss Babs, sir, and wished her kept in disgrace," said nurse. "What nonsense!" exclaimed Uncle Charlie angrily, "and 24 hours afterwards too. It's my opinion the child will be ill from mope. Mind there is no more of it," he exclaimed sharply, as nurse departed with her nose in the air.
"I love you, Uncle Charlie," whispered Babs, a very gentle little Babs just then, and she laid her cheek confidingly on his hand. "And I promise I'll be kite good now." "That's right," said Uncle Charlie, kissing her. He spoke cheerily, owing to an unaccountable sad feeling which had swept over him as he sat beside his little niece's bed, and he wished he had not been so angry with her the day before. "She is so little," he thought pityingly, "and so completely in our power that we ought to be very good to her." The chivalry of the man had been ignited by this little spark of humanity, and manlike he hastened to hide it with cheerful commonplaces. "Shall we play old maids?" he suggested, calling for Teddy to join them. Oh, then they had a delightful time; Babs sitting up in bed, with cheeks almost as red as her flannel dressing gown, and playing as if most truly her fate in this world depended on the disposal of the fated queen. And when the unfortunate lady fell finally to Uncle Charlie's lot, the children's ecstasy of enjoyment knew no bounds. "Teddy,"
said Babs, when Captain Conway had gone to dress for dinner,
"I promised Uncle Charlie that I'd be good, but how can I tell that things won't turn out naughty like the letters did?"
"I don't know," answered her brother doubtfully.
"I wonder why it was so much naughtier to be a postman than a policeman," continued the little girl. "It makes things very puzzling."
"What shall we pretend to be now?" asked Teddy, who could not throw much light on the subject.
"I's tired of postmen,"
said Babs wearily. "I think I'll pretend to be an engine driver," Teddy decided, after some deliberation.
"What's the goodest thing you know?"
asked Babs, anxious to make a safe choice this time. Teddy thought. Kings and queens, but Babs hastened to remind him of the wicked kings that Miss Grimston often read about in the history lessons.
"Well, I don't know then."
Teddy gave it up, together with most other intricate problems.
"I know!" cried Babs suddenly. "Grown-up soldiers what are officers. Uncle Charlie's an officer himself, father in INJA is an officer, and Uncle Jack, and in course they're all very good."
"So they are," agreed Teddy. "You'd better be an officer,
Babs." "That'll be splendid, and sure not to turn out naughty," laughed Babs. I are a real officer, Teddy."
Babs soon got better again, though she did not look quite so fat and brown, and she was also rather graver and quieter than before. Miss Grimston noted a marked improvement in her behaviour in school time, and there were fewer scoldings and punishments, even in the strict atmosphere of the nursery. But it was not altogether well with little Babs. A wistful look had quenched the merry sparkle of her eyes, and her mouth began to droop at the corners, which gave her a rather pitiful expression.
"Why don't you laugh and make things jolly like you used to?"
asked Teddy, grumblingly, one day when Babs was unusually quiet.
"I don't know," said the child sadly. "On'y I are afraid things will turn out naughty like they did afore."
"Why do you bother about it?" asked her brother.
"Oh, Teddy!" she exclaimed reproachfully. "I can't help it, 'cause you see I promised Uncle Charlie I'd be good."
Captain Conway himself was conscious of this change in Babs. He watched her keenly and closely, and saw that she was no longer the bright merry little creature he had found at Cloverdale only 6 months ago. And yet he felt unable to mend matters. His comfort was in the thought that her father and mother would now soon be home, and the child restored, before it was too late, to the happy influences of home life in the country. But, nevertheless, he could not be quite at ease about her, and in his helplessness he turned to his wife, but in vain. "Can't you see what is wrong with the child?" he asked Aunt Elinor almost pleadingly in his anxiety.
"I don't know what you mean," answered his wife carelessly. "I can see nothing."
"You won't see it," said Captain Conway irritably.
"For goodness' sake, don't begin that all over again. I am perfectly sick of all this ridiculous fuss you make about Babs. And if she isn't quite so wild and noisy as she was, let us be thankful."
"You don't understand," said Charlie Conway impatiently. "And yet you ought to," he added sternly. Elinor Conway tossed her pretty head scornfully.
"I am not interested in nursery talk," she said in a hard voice. "If you want any more of it, you had better ring the bell for the nurse."
Her husband did not answer her. He was angry, but he was also suddenly conscious of a great mistake somewhere, which could never be set right. And the pain of such a consciousness silenced all his hurrying words of irritation and displeasure. Aunt Elinor saw the strange look on his face, and she too knew that a crisis had come, though of its nature she was ignorant. But she did not mean to quarrel seriously. It was so silly to quarrel, and over such a trifle too as their little niece. Why need Charlie bother so? It was getting on his nerves, she thought. And he used to be so superior to nerves in his rackety, fast steeple-chasing moods, which were Aunt Elinor's standard of manliness. And Uncle Charlie, in his hunger for something he had missed, was thinking how hopeless it all was. Yet Elinor Conway was exactly the same woman as Elinor West was when Charlie Conway married her for her lovely face. She was the first to break the pause. "Ned and Barbara can't come home as they hoped. It is all uncertain whether Ned can get off now, and it may be years, Barbara says in to-day's letter." "Aren't they coming in the spring, then?" exclaimed Uncle Charlie, aghast. "There seems no chance of it, and here we are saddled with these children interminably. Teddy of course can go to school, but Babs—" "Poor Babs," said her uncle almost to himself, as his wife went out of the room. "Poor Babs." And then as Charlie Conway sat thinking about it all, as he realized that his wife would not, and what perhaps was sadder still, could not help him to do his duty to the child committed to his charge, a sudden big resolve burst into his heart: that Babs' life and character should not be thus spoiled by clumsy or cruel misunderstanding, and he himself would prevent it. That he would take the whole responsibility on his own shoulders, and carry it until he gave the child into her father and mother's care. A very big resolve for Uncle Charlie, who had lived entirely for self and the passing amusements of the hour, shirking all work and responsibility as boring and burdensome. But this new and nobler purpose filled up a little of the fresh found happiness of his life, and brought with it better and brighter days, both for Uncle Charlie and for Babs. CHAPTER X. Christmas.
"Is there Christmas in London same as there is in the country?" asked Babs. "Of course," answered Teddy loftily. "There is Christmas everywhere."
Babs' face brightened.
"I'se glad of that. Then don't you think, Teddy, we ought to be seeing to our money for presents?"
"So we ought. Christmas comes in 2 weeks. I heard nurse say so yesterday."
"I shall give Uncle Charlie a splendid present," continued Babs enthusiastically, "the most splendidest that I can buy."
"Then you will have no money left for the others."
"There aren't no others," argued Babs. "No Nana, nor Giles, nor Mrs. Forrester."
"There's Aunt Elinor and Miss Grimston, and nurse."
"Oh, Teddy! I couldn't really give Miss Grimston a Christmas present, 'cause we'll have a holiday on Christmas Day, and you couldn't give it on another day. And 'sides," added Babs truthfully, "I don't like her enough much."
"I will give Aunt Elinor a little present," announced Teddy, thoughtfully.
"I will give Uncle Charlie an awful big one, and p'raps I will give nurse a needle case what costs a penny."
"When shall we go shopping, Babs?"
"I'll ask Uncle Charlie. He'll take us," added Babs, with a glad note of confidence in her voice. "What fun it will be!"
On the following morning Captain Conway heard a rapping at his dressing room door at a very elementary stage of his toilet. "You must wait a little longer," he shouted, for Babs' visits to her uncle's dressing room had become quite an institution. They were among the new order of things that Uncle Charlie had introduced into nursery administration, and were keenly appreciated by both children, especially Babs, who had often chafed behind the bars of the little wooden gate at the top of the stairs. But that detested barrier had been swept away, together with the command that the children were not to come down stairs unless sent for. They could always now be sure of a welcome in any part of Uncle Charlie's domain.
"Don't we never bother you like we did afore?"
asked Babs, amazed at this new dispensation. "No, little one," answered her uncle, half smiling.
"We must have changed a good bit," said Babs.
"Perhaps it is I who have changed," said Uncle Charlie. And the children both laughed at anything so utterly improbable.
"You see it is like this,"
began Babs, directly the dressing room door was unlocked.
"We want to buy some things for Christmas, and we thought you might see 'bout taking us out shopping one day."
"What made you think that?" asked Uncle Charlie.
"Oh, 'cause you always see 'bout things we want," said Babs, beaming all over, "and give us thousands of treats."
So quickly do children forget the past in the present. Uncle Charlie looked pleased. "What do you want to buy?" he asked.
"A needle case for nurse, a penny one, you know, and a thing for Teddy. A box of chocolates or a bicycle, or anything what he wants, and then the secret. I can't tell you what that is, 'cause it is just to you that it is a secret."
"Well, suppose we go directly after lunch to day," suggested her uncle, smiling.
"'Spose we do!" laughed the child, clapping her hands. "How nice you always think of things," she added fervently, stepping on to the edge of a sponge bath, which immediately stood upright, flooding the room with its contents.
It really was tiresome, such a mess all over everything. And the noise brought in Aunt Elinor, who was very angry indeed.
"I did it,"
gasped Babs, to remove the erroneous impression that it had done it of itself. "Then you are a very naughty child," exclaimed her aunt. Babs looked up at her uncle. "It was an accident," said Captain Conway, gazing ruefully at his spotted shirts and soaked shoes. "An accident climbing on the edge of the bath! Nonsense!" interrupted Aunt Elinor. "Run up stairs and tell nurse to change your clothes," said Uncle Charlie.
"Are I naughty, or only an accident?"
asked the little girl anxiously. She was somewhat in doubt as to whether Uncle Charlie was angry as well as Aunt Elinor. "I don't think you are very naughty," said her uncle, smiling. Babs felt assured, and trotted off cheerfully up stairs, though she left rather loud, cross voices behind her. Nurse, too, met her most disagreeably, and, all during the process of redressing, told her very stern stories of evil little girls who stood on the edges of sponge baths, in which they were afterwards invariably drowned.
"Uncle Charlie wasn't angry," said Babs in self-defense.
Nurse sniffed significantly.
"Why do you always smell so loud when I tell 'bout Uncle Charlie?" asked the child.
"Now then, none of your impertinence," said the nurse severely, giving Babs a harder shake than was necessary into her clean clothes. "Perhaps Uncle Charlie will whip you when you're dry," suggested Teddy, calmly. Babs stood in the middle of a mouthful of bread and milk.
"Oh, Teddy!" she gasped. "I don't really think so. He had not even a cross face, and not a bit a cross voice."
But still it was an unpleasant thought, and lay heavy on the child's soul as she went downstairs a little later in answer to a summons Uncle Charlie had sent up.
"I are dry now," she said gloomily, going up to his chair where he sat smoking. "Quite dry enough to whip."
Her uncle laughed. "But what made you think I was going to whip you?" he asked.
"Teddy thought so, and he made me think it, rather. Are you, Uncle Charlie?" very anxiously. Such a quaint concerned face, with round solemn eyes. Uncle Charlie, stifling the temptation to increase its woe, kissed it back into brightness and laughter, and very dear to him was the earnest assurance: "I love you, Uncle Charlie, much better than anybody in the whole world."
"Better than Giles?" asked Captain Conway.
"Oh, yes, better even than darling Soot,"
she added in the height of fervent affection. "And you won't ever stand on the edges of baths again, will you?" asked Uncle Charlie, as an afterthought.
"Never no more, I promise," she answered solemnly.
"You need not promise, little one, only try to remember." Wherein it was evident that Uncle Charlie had not watched thus carefully over his little niece without learning something of the art of managing her.
"And will you take us shopping after all?" she asked a little wistfully.
"Of course I will," Uncle Charlie assured her. And great was the delight of the nursery world in consequence. It was so important going off with their purses in a hansom, and so exciting having a whole shopful of splendid things to choose from. Babs buried her face in Uncle Charlie's coat while Teddy bought her present, and then Teddy covered his face with his hat during Babs' purchases.
"Now, Uncle Charlie, you must be sure not look while I buy the next thing," said Babs earnestly. And Uncle Charlie promised. It was indeed dreadfully difficult to find something exactly suited to Babs' extraordinary taste. She was quite pale and exhausted with the mental strain when at last the parcel was done up, and Uncle Charlie had returned from gazing out of the window to settle the pecuniary part of the transaction, which was left over even after the children had emptied their purses onto the counter. Just as they were leaving the shop, Babs stopped. "I want to whisper something," she said.
And then, as Uncle Charlie stooped to listen,
"I think I will buy a little present for Aunt Elinor, 'cause I would not like her to be at all pointed, you see, and she might be, if there wasn't one at all from me."
"All right," said Uncle Charlie, with rather a sad smile, knowing how indifferent his wife would be in either case. "What shall we get?"
"You choose."
But none of them took much interest in the purchase of a pretty little matchbox to go on Aunt Elinor's silver table. Babs was full of her parcel, concerning which Uncle Charlie made wildly improbable guesses, and both children were intoxicated with the mere atmosphere of a toy shop. Altogether it was a delightful afternoon, but it made the time between that and Christmas seem terribly long. So long that Babs thought they must have skipped Christmas, as Teddy always skipped the trade winds in the geography lessons. And downstairs a great argument was going on. An invitation had come for Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor to spend Christmas at a house just out of London, where there was to be a dance on Christmas Eve, and of course Aunt Elinor meant to accept it. But Uncle Charlie upset everything by declaring that he intended staying at home with the children. "How absurd you are!" exclaimed Aunt Elinor irritably. "Why, it will be a lovely dance and a very jolly house party. The Heartlands are going," she added, in the hope that her husband would be persuaded by the thought of meeting some great friends. "I should like to go," said Captain Conway, "only I will not disappoint the children." "The children again! Which means Babs, I presume," interrupted his wife disagreeably. And then, as he made no answer, she changed her tone. "Do take me, Charlie. I want so dreadfully to go, and it will be an awful disappointment to me if you won't." Uncle Charlie was just going to refuse his wife's request when he remembered Babs' generosity.
"I would not like her to be at all pointed, you see."
Baby consideration, but it influenced his decision and won Aunt Elinor's cause. "I will go for the dance, then," said Charlie Conway slowly, "and we will come back to town on Christmas Day, and have the children down to late dinner and a Christmas tree in the afternoon." With which Aunt Elinor had to be content. So Uncle Charlie had a lovely Christmas tree made in secret, and the children crept out of bed and hung up their stockings on Christmas Eve, after their usual happy custom. Babs could not sleep very well for the excitement of Santa Claus and his nocturnal visit, so she jumped out of bed very early and felt for the enriched stocking. There it hung, hollow and limp as on the night before. "Oh, Teddy!" she almost groaned, stealing into his room. "Santa Claus has forgot." "Forgot what?" asked Teddy, sleepily.
"Christmas. And the stockings is quite empty,"
cried Babs, in an anguish of disappointment. The awful news banished sleep from Teddy's blue eyes, and the children sat together in the bed sorrowfully regarding the 2 empty black stockings, with a woe almost too deep for words, till nurse came in with the unpleasant information that they were catching their deaths of cold. Breakfast was very serious that morning, and Babs' bread and milk proved unusually choky. The little girl sadly laid her needle case on nurse's plate, and then nurse gave the children each a china mug with "Be good" stamped on in gold letters.
"Do you like the mugs, Teddy?"
asked Babs, when they were alone together.
"No," answered her brother, crossly. "I think they're horrid."
"I think they will make drinking rather too scolding,"
continued Babs,
"'cause that big Be good minds me so much of nurse when she speaks scolding."
"You ought to remember people by their presents," said Teddy.
"I know. 'When this you see, remember me,' Mrs. Forrester always wrote in her presents. But I think I'd rather forget nurse. Wouldn't you, Teddy?"
"Yes, I would. And I hate her old presents."
"Oh, Teddy, I think it would be naughty and rather rude to hate them. But still I do wish that they hadn't been quite such stern mugs."
"Hullo, children! Where are you?" shouted Uncle Charlie directly he came home. "A Merry Christmas to you!"
"Oh, Uncle Charlie!"
screamed Babs, rushing into his arms.
"We aren't a bit merry, 'cause Santa Claus quite forgot our stockings."
"What an idiot I am!" exclaimed Uncle Charlie, who saw that his elaborate Christmas preparations had fallen so short of the mark. And then to the children: "It is all right, youngsters. Santa Claus left me his presents for a Christmas tree this afternoon. A splendid big jolly one," he added, smiling at the sudden change in their faces. "So we will have a Merry Christmas after all."
"Oh, yes,"
laughed Babs.
"I's so glad you've come home, 'cause you make things all right again."
And it really was a beautiful tree, all covered with tiny colored candles and hung with the loveliest presents. Just the very things that children most wanted. There was only one cloud. Aunt Elinor gave Teddy and Babs a little tricycle between them. A very handsome present, but their aunt did not know the anguish of a shared possession.
"Betweens aren't never nobody's real own," complained
Babs afterward. And the very wheels of that dainty little machine seemed almost weighed by the burdensome thought that it was not the rider's very own. One's very own is a mystic charm of childhood that lends lustre even to a discarded pen wiper, or any treasure of the waste paper basket and rag bag. And when the tree was stripped of its miscellaneous fruit, there was the excitement of giving Uncle Charlie his present.
"Guess once more afore you open it,"
said Babs, holding out the little parcel, soiled through much handling. Uncle Charlie felt it carefully while the children shrieked with laughter. "I guess an ink pot," he said at last. Babs clapped her hands.
"Now open it!" she screamed.
And there lay a big, wooden, tartan-painted serviette ring.
"Isn't it lovely?"
exclaimed Babs, proudly.
"The plaid mind me so much of Giles' Sunday pocket handkerchief. And it'll be so useful, 'cause you can have it every day at lunch and dinner."
Uncle Charlie kissed his thanks, and seemed so pleased that the children were delighted. And even Aunt Elinor laughed a little too, and thanked Babs quite kindly for the matchbox. "Here, Parker," said Captain Conway to the butler, "be sure and put this at my place at dinner to night, and at lunch too." "Oh, Charlie," interrupted Aunt Elinor, as the children rushed off to superintend the laying of the table, "not at lunch to morrow. The Heartlands are coming, and it is too awfully vulgar." "Yes, it is too awfully vulgar," repeated her husband, in a curious voice. He was not referring to Babs' taste in the wooden ring, but his wife's hopeless want of taste, in her incapability of ever seeing the deeper thing. Once upon a time, and a very little while ago, Uncle Charlie never looked for the deeper thing himself, and consequently never saw it. And as he was dressing for dinner that Christmas night he wondered how it was that things looked so different to him now, and then he caught Bab's earnest gaze. "I suppose it is by seeing things through your eyes, little one," he said, smiling at her questioning face.
"I don't know what you are talking about,"
answered Babs, laughing up at him. But Uncle Charlie knew what he was talking about. For to see the deeper thing we must look at life through other people's eyes. Which is sympathy. CHAPTER XI. Father and Mother in India. Now the question was whether Father and Mother in India were to become Father and Mother in England at all during Babs and Teddy's childhood. Major and Mrs. Conway were very much puzzled about it in India, and Uncle Charlie and Aunt Elinor were very anxious in England, but the children themselves never gave it a thought. The memory even of Nana was growing faint, and the misty hopes of a good father and mother were entirely swallowed up in the glad reality of a kind uncle.
"There's only one thing I would like," said Babs. "I would like us and Uncle Charlie to live at Cloverdale with Giles for our nurse, and Aunt Elinor and real nurse to stay in London for ever and ever."
But Teddy had begun to go to school, and he greatly enjoyed the companionship of other boys, and above all the games in Kensington Gardens in the middle of the day which one of the younger masters organized. This was rather a sore point with Babs, because Teddy never would acknowledge her in any way if she met the school out walking, and it cut poor Babs to the quick.
"It's silly to nod to you," argued Teddy. "The other boys don't, and they would laugh at me." "But I'm not their sisters," said Babs meekly. "Other fellows don't meet their sisters, and I don't like to meet mine," said Teddy, who was an English schoolboy fledged on the first day of the term. "P'raps they haven't got no sisters," muttered Babs, who was terribly ashamed of being in such a humiliating position of relationship. Teddy's going to school made it very dull for Babs, and Uncle Charlie interfered. "I won't have her shut up alone with that old Grimston ogre," he said to Aunt Elinor. "You must get a young jolly governess." "I don't know the kind you want, so you had better interview them yourself," witheringly. And this was Aunt Elinor's revenge. Female after female arrived in answer to the advertisement, and Uncle Charlie bravely saw them all. The process he felt aged him considerably, but, thanks to his selection, red-cheeked, merry Miss Drew now reigned in the schoolroom, and lessons became games under kindergarten administration, while playtime was truly a dream of delight. For Maggie Drew had half a child's heart even in her 25th year, and she was in touch with many little brothers and sisters in the nursery at home, and with all other children for their sakes. Uncle Charlie peeped into the schoolroom one morning and found Babs and her new governess enveloped in huge pinafores, making clay models of all kinds of quaint animals. A lovely kind of play work which taught Babs more natural history in an hour than all Miss Grimston's pleasant pages put together. "Your pig is too thin. Fatten it up, or mine will be ready for killing first," he heard Miss Drew say, and then peals of laughter followed him as he went downstairs. "She is the right sort at last," he thought, thankfully, as he lit his cigarette. "Please, may I have another help of lemon sponge?" asked Babs at luncheon. "Certainly not," said Aunt Elinor. "You have had 2 already." "But I'm very hungry," pleaded Babs, as if lemon sponge were the most substantial of all viands. "You are very greedy, Babs," continued her aunt. "No, I aren't. Only lemon sponge is so very melting afore you can bite it. The last help I had was nothing but warm air."
Uncle Charlie laughed. "I don't believe you are really a greedy little girl," he said kindly, "but I have a thought."
"Oh, I loves your thoughts," interrupted Babs.
"I will buy you a bottle of sweets for your very own, and it shall be kept in the sideboard cupboard, and you can have one whenever you like without asking. Only you must use your right judgment about it, and then you can show us that you are not greedy." "Oh, Charlie, how ridiculous!" said Aunt Elinor. "The child will be ill in no time." "I'm not so sure of that," said her husband. "People of 5 years old should learn to use their sense." And when he came in that night he brought a lovely big bottle of acid drops, and Babs thought the one he gave her to taste was
"kite the most 'licious sweet I ever eated."
For 2 or 3 days Babs was very careful.
"It makes it so splendid and exciting not to have to ask leave every time," she told Teddy. "I's going to have a sweet," announced the little girl, just as lunch was over a few days afterwards,
and she climbed down off her chair. Aunt Elinor shrugged her shoulders, and Uncle Charlie observed: "I don't think I should eat a sweet directly after a big dinner if I were you, but of course you can if you like."
"It's my right, Judge," said Babs, flushing up and tossing her head.
"All right," said Uncle Charlie. But Babs was a long time at the cupboard door. "What are you doing with your pinafore?" asked her aunt suddenly.
"I's wiping my acid drop dry," exclaimed Babs, "'cause I don't think I'll eat a sweet directly after a big dinner, and if I put it back in the bottle afore it's dry it'll stick to the others."
Uncle Charlie and Elinor both laughed, and her uncle stooped to kiss Babs before he went out. "You are not a greedy little girl, I see," he said gently.
"I knewed I wasn't. On'y I had rather a narrow 'scape to day, didn't I, Uncle Charlie?" she added solemnly. The next mail from India brought very good news for Babs and Teddy. Father and Mother in India were really coming home after all, coming almost at once with Nana and the baby sitter, to fetch the children from London and take them home again to dear old Cloverdale. When Uncle Charlie told them, Teddy and Babs were full of delight and excitement for quite 10 minutes. They were at schoolroom tea, which meal was generally enlivened by Teddy's thrilling accounts of the perils and penalties of school life. From which it would appear that he was one of the most dare-devil characters that had ever defied school discipline, though in reality little Conway was a model of timid propriety in the actual awe-inspiring presence of the masters. "Will Father and Mother in India take me away from school?" asked Teddy anxiously. "Will they take me away from you, dear Uncle Charlie?" questioned Babs.
"They will arrive just in time for the holidays, and take you back to spend them at Cloverdale."
"You too?"
persisted Babs, holding fast his coat sleeve. "Perhaps," said Uncle Charlie, with a tender look in his eyes.
"I wants to show you the new chair in my doll's house, what Miss Drew taught me to make. Will you 'scuse me?" she asked the governess, who gave a smiling consent. But Uncle Charlie was horrified to see a decaying bit of cheese reposing on the grand new chair. He instantly seized it and threw it in the fire. "Oh!" screamed Babs. "You have killed the little darlings. Why did you?"
in an agony of reproach. "It was a nasty bit of cheese and smelt horribly," exclaimed Uncle Charlie, amazed.
"But it was our pet mites," said Babs sadly, "and now they is all burned kite dead."
"Never mind, little one, they are not nice pets for you to have. And you will soon have all your splendid country pets again."
"Oh, yes," cried Babs, quickly diverted. "I do wonder how many of darling Sue's kittens will be alive, and if the rabbits are kite well."
So the interest of their parents' coming centered in the thought of Cloverdale, and Father and Mother in India were regarded as the passports to that enchanted home. One night Babs had been fast asleep for quite 2 hours, when a murmuring of voices disturbed her, and she slowly opened her big brown eyes to see a most surprising sight. A strange lady was leaning over her bed, and by the fireplace sat Nana with a crumpled bundle of white draperies on her knee.
"Oh, Nana!"
shrieked Babs directly her sleepy brain decided that it was not all a dream, and the little girl flew out of bed, brushing past the strange lady, straight into Nana's disengaged arm.
"There, Miss Babs, darling," said Nana, after a very big hug. "Now go and kiss your mamma."
The strange lady was standing alone by the empty bed, gazing at Babs with hungry eyes.
"Come, my darling," she said in a rather broken voice.
For somehow Barbara Conway had never realized before that her home coming would be nothing to her little daughter compared with Nana's; that she was only a stranger while the nurse was a dearly loved friend. Babs stood still with wondering eyes.
"She is a bit sleepy, ma'am," explained Nana. "No, I aren't," interrupted Babs gravely. "I are thinking 'bout things."
"Oh, Babs," cried the lady, "won't you come to me? I am your mother, you know."
"The mother out of Father and Mother in India?"
asked Babs, drawing nearer. "Yes, darling," very gently.
"Then I will kiss you," said Babs, holding up her face. "And where is the other one?"
"Here he is," cried Uncle Charlie, who was standing in the doorway with his brother. "And this is Babs," he added proudly, as the child rushed into his arms and he lifted her up to kiss her father.
"You is like Uncle Charlie,"
said Babs, looking into Major Conway's face critically.
"I's glad of that."
"We're brothers, you know," answered her father.
"And are you as nice as him?"
Babs asked, a little anxiously. "Nicer," said Uncle Charlie, and then they all laughed. Barbara Conway looked rather sadly at the merry group. She seemed so outside her little daughter's world, and she did not know that Babs' experience led the child to shrink from grown up ladies like Aunt Elinor. But Uncle Charlie, seeing the same wistful look in his sister in law's brown eyes that he had tried so hard to banish from her little daughters, understood and held out the child to her mother. "There, Babs," he said gently, "you will be the happiest little girl in the whole world now father and mother in India have come to take care of you in England. Give your mother a very big kiss, because she loves you so much and has wanted you all these years so dreadfully."
"And do you want me now?"
Babs asked, holding her mother's face in her two fat hands, and gazing into it earnestly. "Yes, my darling, much more than I can tell you." And Barbara Conway felt as if she must break down.
"Then I's glad you've come, and I will love you too, and kiss you tight and hard like I do Uncle Charlie,"
promised Babs. And her mother stayed with her, whispering very tender, soothing talk till Babs' sleepy eyes closed. And when Ned Conway came up to look for his wife, he found her with her head on Babs' pillow, and his little daughter's rosy cheek pressed close against her mother's. The next morning Babs rushed into Teddy's room, feeling very superior.
"Did you see father and mother in India last night?"
she asked, hoping most fervently that he had not.
"No," said Teddy. "I never woke in the night at all." "I did," exclaimed Babs proudly, "and I know them quite well. Father minds me very much of Uncle Charlie, but mother isn't a bit like Aunt Elinor."
Teddy jumped into his clothes as quickly as time and cold fingers would permit, and he and Babs tore downstairs. A tall gentleman ran out and caught them on the second landing, and before breakfast Teddy knew father and mother in India almost as well as Babs did. "Can you play cricket?" Teddy asked his father at breakfast. "Rather," exclaimed Uncle Charlie. "Why, your father is a splendid cricketer, old fellow." "And you shall be one too, my boy," said Major Conway. "We will practice all the holidays." And with a father who was a first class cricketer, what more could any English schoolboy want?
"Mother,"
said Babs afterwards, jumping on to her knee violently, and putting one fat arm as far as it would reach round Mrs. Conway's neck,
"do you mind much about me not being pretty like Aunt Elinor does?"
"Oh, my darling, what do you mean? I think you are the dearest, nicest little daughter in the whole world, and I would not have you one tiny bit different."
"Wouldn't you?"
exclaimed Babs, amazed.
"Hadn't you rather my hair was golden or something?"
"No, no," her mother assured her. "I love you best just as you are, dear."
"I's so glad," murmured the child, "'cause it makes there nothing nasty to think about."
Just then Nana came in with the baby.
"My new sister is very funny," observed Babs, regarding her with interest, "but I don't think she will ever be able to walk, mother, do you? Her feet are 'zactly like mole's feet."
"They are not quite big and strong enough yet, but very soon baby will run about and play with you."
"And make up for Teddy's being at school. Oh, mother, I are glad you came, 'cause it was so dull afore when Teddy went to school."
"It won't be dull ever again, for we shall be at Cloverdale, and you will have baby and me always to play with."
"Can you play? I didn't think grown up ladies ever could play. I thought it messed their dresses."
"Mine don't matter, and we will wear comfortable old ones."
"That'll be jolly," laughed Babs. "And, mother, we will take Uncle Charlie to Cloverdale, too?"
"Oh, yes. Your father and Uncle Charlie used to play together when they were little boys, and they will want to play together again now."
"Me, too. Uncle Charlie's sure to let me play with them. He always does, you see, mother."
"You are very fond of Uncle Charlie, I think, Babs."
"In course I am. I b'long to Uncle Charlie, you know."
"Not to your father and me?" exclaimed her mother. Babs looked puzzled.
"Half to you and half to father, but I think the biggest half to Uncle Charlie."
"Yes, dear, that is it. You belong to us because we are your father and mother, but I think you must always belong to Uncle Charlie, too, because he has been so good to you."
"I don't think we will take Aunt Elinor to Cloverdale,"
added Babs, and just then the baby began to cry, which changed the conversation. But her mother heard and understood. CHAPTER XII. Home again.
"Daddy, Daddy!"
shouted Babs, scrambling through the morning room window at Cloverdale and tearing across the lawn. "Here I am. What is it?" called Major Conway from the cricket pitch, where he and Teddy were having a little practice.
"Have you seen Dash? Mummy and me's lost him, and we's rather 'fraid 'bout the new chickens."
"No, he hasn't come this way," said her father, stooping to kiss the dear brown little face, which looked up so eagerly into his own. He could not help kissing Babs whenever he met her. She had such splendid fat cheeks, and such a merry, laughing face altogether, that it was irresistible. How the children did love being back at Cloverdale! And it was far nicer now than ever before, because father and mother at home were so much better and dearer and jollier than father and mother in INJA. Every single day was so happy, unspoiled by the curse of best frocks or gloves, or even continual cleanliness. And Babs was almost intoxicated with the bliss of those long summer days after her year of life in London.
"Dash hasn't come this way, Mummy,"
called Babs, as Mrs. Conway appeared in the distance, and then she started running towards her mother with all the speed of which her short fat legs were capable. "Then we must go and look for him in the poultry yard. I'm afraid he has gone there."
"I's 'fraid so, too."
And their fear was fully realized, for at the very entrance to the poultry yard lay a beautiful big chicken quite dead, while Dash, with the innocent countenance dogs know so well how to assume, sat gazing at the beauties of nature, evincing a slightly bored interest in the question as to how the best white chicken could possibly have met with its death.
"Oh, Mommy!"
gasped Babs, gazing with sorrow on the murdered fowl.
"And it looked as if it was just going to lay a little boiled egg."
"Never mind, darling. But it is really very naughty of Dash." Babs promptly made for the degenerate spaniel, but Dash had apparently just remembered an important engagement at the other end of the garden, and hastened to fulfill it.
"Is anybody coming to lunch to day?"
asked Babs presently. "Yes, a soldier friend of Daddy's."
"Soldiers aren't quite what I used to think when I was little, Mummy."
"Aren't they, dear? Why not?"
"Well, you see, they kill fewer people, and play games a good lot more than fighting. I know heaps of soldiers now. Uncle Charlie, and Daddy, and Uncle Jack, and the friend what is coming to day makes 4.
"But then you don't see them in battles, you know, Babs."
"No," said the child doubtfully. "But, Mummy, I think it's nicer to play games than kill people, and I are glad that Uncle Charlie and Daddy is that sort."
Her mother laughed. "I think Daddy and Uncle Charlie are the right sort, too."
"The very rightest in the whole world," said Babs enthusiastically.
"This is my little girl," said Major Conway, introducing Babs to his friend, just before luncheon. "And how many of you are there?" Captain Eardley asked her presently.
3, and the paroquet makes 4, answered Babs quickly. "And Teddy goes to school, but I have a governess. I can do lots of sums," she added proudly, "adding and taking away ones."
"That is very clever of you," said the gentleman.
"It is not quite so clever as it might be," she confessed candidly, "'cause the last little girl what my governess taught could do borrowing afore she was 6. But though I are rather backward in my lessons, I are very forward in my play, Teddy says."
After lunch Mrs. Conway and the children went out into the garden, and Teddy induced his mother to bowl to him for a little, but Babs, for some occult reason, returned to the dining room, where the gentlemen were smoking. "Run away now, Babs," said her father.
"Daddy, I's 'fraid I can't," answered the child, with a flushed face but fixed expression.
Major Conway was intensely surprised. "Babs," he exclaimed, "what do you mean?"
"I feels I must stay," continued Babs, "'cause I want to so dreadful much."
Her father did not care to prolong the contest or bore his friend with domestic discipline, so he proposed a game of billiards, and the gentlemen walked off, leaving Babs standing in the middle of the room with crimson cheeks. "I am sorry you are a disobedient little girl," Major Conway said gravely, as he went out and shut the door. After a few minutes' deliberation, Babs walked slowly down to the cricket pitch, and stood looking on with so solemn a face that her mother's attention was attracted. "Has anything gone wrong, Babs?" she asked quickly. "Something has gone wrong," answered Babs impressively. "What is it, dear?" Babs looked bored. "I think it is too difficult to tell you, Mummy." "Oh, no, my darling. Come and sit on my knee and whisper it." "I think I could tell it better from here," said Babs, looking straight up into the sky. "Very well, dear. What is it?" Babs continued gazing heavenwards, and observed, "I are naughty." "What kind of naughtiness?" asked her mother, surprised. "The worst what there is," replied Babs, with such earnestness as befitted so serious a confession. Mrs. Conway stifled a strong desire to laugh. "And what is that? Tell me all about it." "Disobedience to daddy," continued Babs, becoming interested in the narrative, "and he is very sorry about it. Not a nice comforting kind of sorry, but rather a stern, solemn sorry." "Oh, Babs! And I hope you are sorry, too." "I think I shall be soon," said Babs discreetly, "but I can't be quite sure yet." "Well, dear, directly you are sure, I would go and tell daddy if I were you." "It rained yesterday when I was out," began Babs, irrelevantly. "Very hard drops of rain." And then she picked up her hat and walked slowly away, swinging it by the elastic and talking aloud to herself to keep up her spirits. "It is very hot to day, and rather uncomfortable, too. I 'specs that's what makes my cheeks so thirsty. I will go and dig in my garden, and then I shall be quite happy." But digging in her garden even did not make Babs happy. "It keeps getting uncomfortabler," she continued, stopping to rest, "and my old things aren't growing a bit nice," giving some precious radish tops a vicious smack with her spade. "P'raps they want water. It'll be jolly watering them with my watering can." But somehow even the watering can failed to charm. "The water seems wetter than it generally is," she said crossly, stooping down to rub a big splash off her stocking, and then she kicked the can right over, and stood gloomily watching the wandering streams of water on the path. "Sakes alive!" observed Giles, coming up at that moment. "What a mess the child be making, to be sure! What's the matter, little missy?" he asked, seeing her disconsolate face. "Nothing is the matter, Giles," said Babs, drawing herself up, "and I think you are very interfering to call my garden 'what a mess.'" Old Giles looked at Babs in amazement. "My conscience alive!" he observed. "You are in the tantrums, to be sure, and no mistake." Babs flushed up to the roots of her hair. "When people are very hot and uncomfortable, Giles," she exclaimed, "and other people will keep on talking so much it makes it very," racking her brains for a suitable epithet, "very beastly indeed. My garden wanted watering badly, and in course I was 'bliged to 'tend to it." And Babs marched away, trying to look as dignified as a fat little girl in a dirty pinafore can. She went across the orchard and down the steps, round the corner, on to the lower lawn, where Major Conway was sitting alone in the shade. "Oh!" exclaimed Babs in surprise, and then stood still. "Babs," called her father, "come here to me." Babs advanced slowly. She was a little in doubt as to how events would shape themselves. "Babs," said Major Conway, very gravely, "have you anything to say to me?" Babs looked up to the sky and down to the ground. "I have something, but it is almost too hard to say now. I thought it might be easier after tea." "It will be harder after tea. Try to say it now, little one." "Oh, you speak just like Uncle Charlie, then," exclaimed Babs, brightening a little. "And I are sorry I was naughty, daddy." "That is right," said her father, lifting her on to his knee and kissing her. "Now I are sorry, will you leave off being?" "Yes, Babs, and you will not be disobedient any more, will you?" "No, I won't. And, do you know, I think it was you being sorry, and me not, what made things all so hot and uncomfortable?" "Yes, that was it." "Well, I'se good now, daddy, kite good. Oh, here is Mummy come. Mommy!" she shouted at the top of her voice. "I have left off being naughty, and daddy has kite forgived me. "That's all right," cried Mrs. Conway, and as she came up to him, "I shall soon be quite a cricketer. Even Teddy says I am improving in my bowling." "We must have a match," said Major Conway.
"Oh, yes," cried Babs. "You and I will play Mommy and Teddy."
And then, as her brother scoffed at such a girlish idea,
"Daddy, I want to ask you something. Will you give me some little onias for my garden?"
"Some little what?"
"Onias. You have big onias in your garden, and I thought I would like some little ones in mine."
Her father and mother both laughed. "Your garden looks rather sloppy," said Major Conway, regarding the damp plot.
"That's the naughtiness," remarked Babs, truthfully. "It made me rather overwater it, I think."
"That was a pity," said the Major.
"It was," echoed Babs, solemnly.
There was great excitement at Cloverdale when Major Conway's big packing cases arrived from India. The relics of his sport there excited the children beyond all bounds, and inspired Babs with most oriental pretences. The garden became a jungle, and every day full of thrilling adventures with tigers, elephants, or bears. She never went out without her little toy gun as a protection against these savage beasts, and Major Conway was called upon to tell endless stories of the adventures he had met with in his life of sport in India.
"I have shot 3 tigers this morning," announced Babs one day at luncheon, "and 2 of them was man-eaters."
"You had good sport, then," said her mother, who always entered splendidly into the children's pretences.
"I had."
"What shall you do with the skins?" asked Major Conway.
"I shall send them to the British Museum, Daddy. My Indian servants is getting them quite ready now."
"That is all right. And did you see any other animals?"
"I did. I saw a black panther creeping round the tool house, and 4 hyenas in the wood, sides a wild boar and a grey ape."
Babs' imagination had always been active, but fed by her father's stories and her own recently acquired power of reading to herself, it grew much more luxuriantly. But Teddy's was fading fast, swamped by the glorious reality of cricket and the English boy's passion for games. Besides, he was a schoolboy now, and was quickly becoming the heartless, mindless, soulless creature which is generally to be found in preparatory and public schools. But he was a healthy, happy little fellow notwithstanding, and his father rejoiced in his good length bowling and steady batting, which after all are so much more suited to schoolboy life and ambition than a thoughtful temperament or a vivid imagination. His mother laughed lovingly at his boyish brag, and even consented, at his earnest request, to allow the barber to cut the curling ends off his golden hair. So Teddy ceased to be a child, and became a boy.
"I's been reading to myself," said Babs, "and was 'bout a very sad thing."
"What was it, darling?" asked Mrs. Conway. Babs seized upon any and every book she could find, and her parents loved to listen to her literary experiences.
"It was 'bout a very good lady what was a martyr. What is a martyr, Mummy?"
Then, without waiting for an answer,
"And she was eat by lions in the amphitheater."
"How dreadful!" exclaimed Mrs. Conway.
"Why are you laughing, Daddy? 'Cause it really was kite a solemn sad story."
"Do you like sad stories?" her father asked her hurriedly.
"I like all the stories what was ever written," replied Babs, enthusiastically. "I don't," said Teddy, "'cause books are a sort of lessons, and lessons are all a fag."
"You like games best, my son," said his mother, smiling.
"Rather," exclaimed Teddy, "and cricket best of all. Don't you?"
"Well, since I hurt my hand so much trying to catch that ball of Daddy's, I am not so fond of cricket. For to tell the truth, I am frightened of those fast balls."
"Which are you most frightened of, Mummy?"
asked Babs, whose mind was still in the jungle.
"Fast balls or black panthers?"
"Fast balls just now, dear."
"And I am. Teddy calls me Butterfingers, but I really can't catch them 'cause they're so full of hurting."
"That's just like a girl," exclaimed Teddy, scornfully.
"You are such a coward." "Oh, Teddy, I'm not. You have to be kite as brave to kill and hunt wild beasts as to catch quick balls."
"But you don't kill wild beasts," exclaimed Teddy. "That's only pretending." Babs stood aghast at this heresy.
I shouldn't be at all surprised if you has to be eaten by that pack of wolves what I saw in the plantation this morning," she said loftily. " Stuff and rubbish," answered Teddy, rudely. " Babs, Babs," called her mother, " here is a letter for you from Uncle Charlie." " Oh, how splendid ! But, mummy, I do wish Uncle Charlie would come here soon, 'stead of writing. Uncle Charlie and me miss each other very bad." " Yes, dear, I know." But neither Mrs. Conway nor any one else knew how much the Captain missed his little niece. Babs left an empty room in the house in Onslow Square, but Aunt Elinor soon filled that with smart clothes and new dresses, and was glad of the space. And Babs also left an empty room in Uncle Charlie's life. A room which could not be filled by race horses, or polo ponies, or club friends, or any of the gaieties of former London seasons. A quiet dark room wherein lay a few dusty toys and baby memories, yet Uncle Charlie chose to live in it rather than in the glaring, gas-lit atmosphere which was Aunt Elinor's native air. And as he waited alone in this empty room, Charlie Conway's eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, and he saw, for the first time in his life, as the legacy that Babs had unconsciously left him, the outline of the Ideal. End of Chapter 12. End of The Young Pretenders, by Edith Henrietta Fowler. Recorded by Celine Major.